Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for coming to the fourth public meeting of the city's Refinery Advisory Group. The purpose of this meeting is to get feedback from the perspective of the academic and environmental communities tonight. I want to take a minute to thank the members of the Advisory Group's Academic and Environmental Committee, Mark Hughes, Christine Knapp, Pete DiCarlo, Anna Ship, and Christina Simeone, as well as Tom Farley and Pat Patterson for all the work you put into this process as well. I also, as always, want to thank Prep Charter School once again for graciously allowing us to use their school, and thank all of you for the time that you're here tonight. As I said last week, we know this is a very difficult and painful issue. Hundreds of highly skilled and dedicated workers lost their jobs last week. Hundreds more are wondering what happens now that the work that their contracted employees used to perform at the refinery has dried up. Countless families throughout the region are facing uncertainty over their future, and we heard from many of these voices last week, and we're grateful for their input. Last week, we also heard from many members of the community nearest the refinery. We gathered that feedback they offered through small group discussions, as well as personal stories they told in the video storyboard that was set up. Many of these groups face difficult conversations because many people feel strongly about this issue from different points of view. But these are important conversations to have. And while we'll have more of those conversations within the community as we move forward, I want to announce that we will be adding another community-focused meeting in the weeks ahead. We heard from many of you that what worked well in the last meeting and what could have been improved, and we'll also take that feedback seriously as we plan our next meeting. But tonight's goal is to hear from experts from the academic and representatives from the environmentally focused groups. We look forward to hearing more from their perspectives on the refinery and what we as a city need to know and think about as we move into the future. Many people want to speak tonight. We've actually have a long list of speakers that have already been signed up, and for that reason we've actually had to close sign up. And I apologize for that. Again, we've added another community meeting to make sure other voices are heard. We have a hard stop tonight of 8:30 that we have to be out of the school in order for them to manage their maintenance and security needs. We also are encouraging people to use our email address, refinery@phila.gov, in order to share your comments in writing. As we begin this meeting, I want to stress how important it is to be respectful to everyone. I know we all have lots of opinions, and we all have a different point of view around this issue, and that's why we've organized the meetings the way we have, to hear those different perspectives. This is a public meeting, and everyone is entitled to their opinions and to share those opinions, but everyone also is entitled to have a safe and respectful environment. Anyone who shouts anyone down or acts out in a confrontational manner toward anyone else will be removed with the help of Civil Affairs. If this is your first meeting, I want to give you a brief reminder about why we're here. The purpose of the advisory group is to help the city convene a wide array of stakeholders who have different perspectives and expertise on the refinery. The advisory group will not make policy or make any specific decisions. Instead, the people who are on the advisory group have been tasked with convening stakeholders to present information to the city. Many of the people in this group do not agree with each other on many issues. And as I had mentioned earlier, that was deliberate. We want to make sure that these members can tap into their networks and bring a wide array of perspectives and opinions to the table. The goal of this process is to gather information and perspectives, to listen. We want people to be a part of the process by telling city officials what we need to know and what we should be thinking about. As noted during the last 3 meetings, there are many things about the refinery site that are not within the city's control. After all, it is a privately owned site. But we want to make sure we are asking the right questions, thinking about the right things, and planning for a variety of scenarios as the future of the PES site becomes clearer. There's one more meeting scheduled in the weeks ahead for specific constituencies to make presentations. Again, I mentioned we will be adding a community-based meeting that will be announced shortly. We've already heard from community and organized labor, and tonight we hear from academic and environmental experts. On September 9th, we'll hear from the business community. Those details will be published. Again, that community meeting will be publicized in the near future. And at the conclusion of this process, remember that all the feedback we have will be publicly available in a report, and the city will be making recommendations to the mayor. The city meaning the managing director, making recommendations to the mayor. Please continue to check the advisory group's website for periodic updates at phila.gov/refinery. And now I'm going to, actually, before I turn it over to you, Mark, I do want to add one additional thank you to Chris Roop and Javon Davis, who have staffed this committee. You guys have done a tremendous amount of work. I will say this again probably in the future, but I appreciate the work that you put into this. I appreciate the transcribing that is going into our website, and the effort to be transparent in all of our work. It is not easy to transcribe hundreds of pages of big tablet notes, and so that work is appreciated. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mark Hughes. Make brief introductions, and then we'll turn it over to Mark Hughes. Again, I think at this point, folks recognize or know who I am. I'm Brian Abernathy. I'm the city's managing director.
I'm Adam Thiel. I'm the fire commissioner and emergency management director. I'll also apologize in advance. I just came from a now 3-alarm church fire in West Philly. So if I have to leave, it's nothing anybody said. It's just duty calls.
Tom Farley, I'm the health commissioner for Philadelphia.
I am Pat Patterson. I'm the regional director for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection.
I'm Christine Knapp. I'm the director of the city's Office of Sustainability.
Pete DiCarlo, I'm an associate professor at Drexel University of Environmental Engineering and Chemistry.
Mark Hughes, I'm the faculty director at Penn of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy.
I'm Anna Ship. I'm the executive director of the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia.
Ryan O'Callahan, Steelworkers.
Mark Lynch, Local 98 Electricians.
Is this one on too? Yeah. Hello, everyone. I just want to be very brief right now and make sure that everyone knows how we'll be beginning the public meeting. I'll have a couple more comments to say when we turn into the comments from the public, a very long list of 27 speakers who have registered to speak. Anyone else who would like to speak, if we have any daylight between the 27th speaker and 8:30 when we must leave, you're more than welcome to sign up with my colleague Molly Simon at the very end of the table. For now, I just want to make sure that everyone understands that we'll be beginning with 2 information sessions from PADEP and the city's health department. Those are going to be longer sessions than any of the speakers will have tonight. You will be speaking for only 3 to 5 minutes, but the first 2 will be longer. So we're going to begin with those, and then when we start the public comments period, we'll have a few more words to say then. And there are lots of seats on this side for those of you who are standing but would rather be sitting. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Howard from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection.
All right. Is this one on?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm David Brown. That's the name. Not Ms. Dr. Howard. David Brown. I'm with the Department of Environmental Protection. I am the manager of the land recycling program in our environmental cleanup and brownfields program. So thank you. We're very glad to be here this evening. I have a lot of information for you. Might be a bit overwhelming in 30 minutes, but I'm hoping it's going to be very helpful both to the advisory group and also for public understanding of the cleanup work that's been going on at the refinery. All right, so here's an outline of what I'm going to be covering. I'm going to give some background of the regulations that apply here. Most of you are not going to be familiar with them, so I just want to have that to sort of set the tone of what has been going on here. And then I'll get into some of the history of the cleanups that have been taking place, an overview of the current work under Act 2, which is our land recycling program, current status, sort of what's coming up in the next year or so, and then to wrap up what some of the key cleanup issues are right now. So before I get into all that, I want to just sort of put some boundaries around the scope of my presentation. So I'm with the Department of Environmental Protection. Our mission is to protect human health and the environment. So we are not a zoning agency or a planning commission. We do not make decisions on the land use. Our job is to make sure that the site is cleaned up in a manner that's going to be protective of whatever intended use it has. So when I'm talking about cleanup, what I'm referring to is the contamination that's in the soil, the groundwater, and that can be getting into the river. So there's all sorts of other pollution at the refinery. There's air emissions, there's waste, and others. That's not the subject of this talk, though. Just the cleanup of essentially the ground. When a site like this is cleaned up, it is not necessarily cleaning up every contaminant that's there. So there's a focus on the risk drivers, the contamination that could imperil human health. And lastly, Pennsylvania law does not require a cleanup to conditions before there was industrial use. There still can be contamination that remains, but it needs to be managed properly. All right, so I'm going to be going through some of the state cleanup programs, also a federal cleanup program that applies to the refinery. There are 2 state cleanup programs. The land recycling program is commonly known as Act 2. And so the purpose of this program is to encourage cleanup of properties to put them back into productive use. We consider it the brownfields program for Pennsylvania, although it's a much broader application than just brownfields. It's often referred to as a voluntary cleanup program. Now, in the case of the refinery, it's not voluntary, and you'll see that in a few minutes. But the remediator, which is the party that's undertaking the cleanup, has a lot of flexibility under Act 2 in terms of what cleanup standard they're going to meet and how they're going to accomplish that. The end result of an Act 2 cleanup is what we call liability relief. So this is a legal protection for the property owner and the remediator. It protects them from further action by the department. So in Act 2, we have 3 cleanup standards, but the 2 that are really relevant to the refinery are statewide health and the site-specific standard. So statewide health standard is what most people would think of as a cleanup. It would be to like a drinking water standard. So these are numerical standards that are based on risks. They're protective of health. In some cases, it's not feasible to clean up to statewide health standards, and so the site-specific standard is an alternative. So with the site-specific standard, contamination can remain. If that's going to happen, then the remediator needs to demonstrate that there's no excess risk from that contamination. So they might do a scientific risk assessment, or they might take measures to eliminate exposures to that contamination. For instance, if it's in the soil, they might cap the soil. They might put a barrier down to prevent any exposure of people to that contamination. Act 2 has some very prescriptive reporting requirements, and they begin with submittal of a notice of intent to remediate. This is just a form that lets us know that the site is going to enter the program. And under the site-specific standard, there are a series of additional reports. The remedial investigation report is a key part of that, and that's also called a site characterization. That's a determination of the conditions of the soil, of the groundwater. It's all the data. There may be a risk assessment report, a cleanup plan, which is going to describe how they're going to accomplish the cleanup and meet the standards, and then it'll end with a final report. All of these are reviewed by the department. Act 2 also has public involvement requirements. So every submittal to us, there must be a newspaper notice, and there also needs to be a notice to the city. When that notice of intent to remediate is filed with DEP, the city has an opportunity to request a public involvement plan. And so that's a more involved way to involve the public in the cleanup. So it typically will include a public meeting, availability of documents to the public, and opportunities for comment. All right, so that's the Act 2 cleanup program. We also have a Pennsylvania tanks cleanup program. This is called corrective action. There are numerous regulated storage tanks at the refinery, and if there's a release of a substance from one of those tanks, that goes into the corrective action program. It's very similar to Act 2. The reporting requirements are similar. And the cleanup standards that a corrective action site or corrective action cleanup needs to meet are going to be the Act 2 standards. They're the same cleanup standards. The federal cleanup program that applies to the refinery is under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. It's also called corrective action. RCRA regulates facilities that handled hazardous wastes, and the refinery was one that certainly did that. So corrective action comes into play, again, when there's a release to the environment of those materials. Different procedures than Act 2, but really the end result is sort of similar, that they need to come up with remedies, they need to accomplish a cleanup and demonstrate that. Between DEP and EPA, we have developed what's called the One Cleanup Program. And this is sort of a merger of the federal and the state programs. So it will allow a property owner like PES or the remediator of the refinery to enter One Cleanup, perform an Act 2 cleanup, but also satisfy the RCRA corrective action requirements. The work then is overseen by both agencies, both federal and state. All right, so next I'm going to get into some of the regulatory history for the refinery. As you know, there are many different companies and entities involved here. Sunoco to PES, and so I'll just briefly talk about the roles these different companies play. Sunoco started by buying the Point Breeze facility in 1988, later Girard Point in 94, and then they operated the refinery until 2012. So when they acquired these refineries, they also took ownership of the environmental liabilities that they had. So all the legacy contamination that previous operators back to the 19th century caused, Sunoco accepted that. Sunoco stepped out in 2012. They were acquired by Energy Transfer Partners, which is a Texas pipeline company. And they formed a subsidiary called Evergreen, which manages their environmental liabilities. So Evergreen is a company that is handling the cleanup of the Philadelphia refinery, as well as many other former Sunoco operations. PES came on the scene in 2012. They are responsible for contamination that they have caused in the last 7 years. Energy Transfer, by the way, holds a minority ownership share in PES. All right. There was not much in the way of environmental investigation or remediation at the refinery until the 1980s, when Sunoco was starting to look at buying the facility. So in 1993, as the state became aware of the contamination there, we signed a consent order and agreement with Sunoco that required that they do certain things. They needed to do environmental investigations. They needed to remediate contamination that was present. And the purpose of this was to protect the Schuylkill River, which was getting impacted by seepage of contamination and discharges, and also infiltration of contamination into the city sewer system. There were reporting requirements that came along with this agreement and additional oversight that the state had on the work that was taking place. A few years after this, there started to be reports of petroleum odors in the city sewers in neighborhoods to the east of the refinery. And that was investigated and found to originate likely in part from the refinery. And so Sunoco installed a sewer vapor collection system, and that is still operating today. As an aside, the refinery is not the only major petroleum contamination site in South Philadelphia. There are others as well. One of those is the Defense Supply Center Philadelphia, which isn't far from here. It's the Quartermaster Plaza Shopping Center on Oregon Avenue and some of that surrounding land. And I'm not going to get into details of that, but there is interaction between these two sites as well. The 93 agreement was renewed in 2003, and it was expanded at that time because Sunoco had acquired Girard Point and the Schuylkill River Tank Farm. A more comprehensive characterization was required, additional steps to remediate contamination. And this agreement also required that they enter the Act 2 program that I was talking about a few minutes ago. Sunoco did that in 2006. They filed a notice of intent to remediate. The city at that time requested a public involvement plan, and Sunoco held an initial public information session in 2007 and created a public involvement plan as they were required to do. DEP and EPA accepted them into the One Cleanup Program 2011, and Sunoco then started doing their Act 2 reporting in 2011. Move ahead a few years, 2012, with the transaction to PES. DEP, Sunoco, and PES signed a three-party agreement, a buyer-seller agreement, that laid out new responsibilities for Sunoco, the seller, and PES as the buyer. The gist of this is that they needed to continue with Act 2, and Sunoco was going to perform that work, and we gave them a deadline. December 2020, they needed to complete work. PES, as the buyer, had some obligations as well. They needed to restrict their use of the property to commercial and industrial purposes, and they also needed to maintain any controls that were used to manage contamination that Sunoco would rely on to meet that standard. Around the same time, EPA also signed a settlement agreement with Sunoco and PES that had its own obligations, but one of those was financial assurance, in which Sunoco needed to demonstrate that they had the financial ability to perform the remediation that was needed. All right, so I'm going to get in to some of the details of the cleanup that's been taking place the last several years, and this is a map to orient you. The DSCP site that I mentioned is located here. Belmont Terminal is yet another site. So Belmont Terminal was operated by Sunoco Logistics, another Sunoco-related company. It is separate from the refinery, but it's had its own releases of gasoline and contamination that have affected this area. Sunoco and now Evergreen have submitted multiple Act 2 reports. As shown on the figure, there are 10 different areas of investigation, or AOIs, and they have submitted reports for all of those, documenting the remedial investigation and characterization. DEP has reviewed those, and 8 of them we have approved. 2 of them were disapproved, and additional work was needed for those, and that work involved additional groundwater investigation, additional sampling, to understand the extent of that contamination beyond their property boundaries. A couple other Act 2 reports that have been submitted. One is an additional area of investigation called number 11. Sunoco labeled this as the deep aquifer, the deeper groundwater underneath South Philadelphia. That report was disapproved by DEP, and subsequently Evergreen has folded that work into the separate AOI reports that have been submitted for the different areas. Lastly, there was a lead risk assessment report submitted in 2015, which we approved. This was a health-based calculation of a lead standard for soil. All right, this is a list of the contaminants of concern at the refinery. Again, these are not all the contaminants that may be present. These are ones that under mutual agreement are the most toxic, the ones that are of greatest concern. 24 different chemicals, volatile organic chemicals. Lead is the one metal of concern. Some of these are a little more significant than others. Benzene is probably the primary risk driver at the refinery. It's widespread, present in soil and groundwater. Some of the others are noted on here. And then at the refinery, we also deal with something called LNAPL, light non-aqueous phase liquid. This is just a term for oil. It's oil that is not dissolved or dissipated into the ground. It floats on top of the groundwater. So there are areas of the refinery in which LNAPL is present, essentially as pools of oil under the surface. All right, so I have a couple maps here showing examples of contaminant distributions. These are benzene concentrations in the shallow groundwater. This is AOI 11, Belmont Terminal. It also shows the data from the DSCP site. So as you can see, there's sort of a mingling of these plumes of contamination. This is LNAPL distribution. This is sort of the same area. Belmont Terminal up here, tanks in AOI 11. This is 26th Street. So these different colored areas are different types of oil, gasoline, diesel, things like that. So this is a summary of where there are issues at the boundaries of the refinery. Evergreen needs to deal with the contamination interior, but we're a little more concerned about what might be migrating into the river or into properties that are adjacent to the refinery. So this just highlights some of those areas. 26th Street, Penrose Avenue. This is up in the north near Main Lane. The PGW, Philadelphia Gas Works property, and along Essington Avenue. Another aspect of this work is what's going on in the deeper aquifer. There are some concerns about whether that contamination could be migrating under the Delaware River and getting to Jersey. This is being looked at by Evergreen, and one aspect of this is modeling, doing computer modeling to understand how that plume can move over time, and this is just an example of that work. Storage tank cleanups. There are about 196 regulated storage tanks at the refinery. Many of them over the years have had releases. Most of those releases have been cleaned up. There are about 35 that are remaining, and that cleanup work is being done as part of the Act 2 cleanup. PES has had a handful of tank releases over the years. At this point, they have only one that remains that is still in the corrective action program. Groundwater remediation. So I sort of told you all about the contamination or what's being done about cleaning it up. In about the last 30 years, Sunoco and Evergreen have run at least 18 remedial systems. Presently, about half of those are still operating. The purpose of these has been to protect the river, prevent contamination from migrating at property boundaries, and prevent it from getting into sewers. They have recovered over 325,000 gallons of oil in the last 30 years, and that work is ongoing. All right, so what I've told you in the last few minutes is the tip of the iceberg. There is a huge amount of work that's been done, reports that have been submitted to EPA and DEP, tons of information. Evergreen has created this website, which is publicly available, in which all those reports have been uploaded and are available to the public. We have also asked them to provide our decisions, our reviews, our letters that we've issued, comments on these reports, so that that's all available. That address is shown up there. Now, Evergreen, as part of their public involvement plan, has also made electronic versions of their reports available at two of the public libraries in the area, Thomas Donafucci Public Library in the Eastwick branch. Another source of information is DEP's EFACS site. And this is a place where you can get information on when, essentially notifications of when reports come in, as well as what's been done historically. If you want paper, the paper documents are also available. They're at DEP's Norristown office. and anybody can make an appointment to come in and take a look at those files. And that information is also available up there. All right, so moving on to sort of the current status and what is forthcoming. Evergreen needs to complete their characterization. There were those 2 areas in which DEP disapproved the reports. They need to do further investigation. That work has largely been done, but it hasn't yet been submitted to us. Those areas are shown here. AOI 4 is near Penrose Avenue, where there's some contamination at the property boundary. AOI 9 is the Schuylkill River Tank Farm. There are a couple places, Essington, and sort of in the southern area near the Mingo Basin, where there is some contamination that they needed to better delineate. Evergreen submits semi-annual progress reports. Those are mostly descriptive of the remedial work that's being done. And then they need to go through a series of steps to complete Act 2. They need to do groundwater modeling, risk assessment, they need a cleanup plan, and then they need a final report that's their demonstration of attainment of the standard. The final step is an environmental covenant. This is going to be a document that's placed on the property's deed and that will have restrictions on use of that property. For example, no groundwater use, maintenance of vapor controls, things like that. Coming back now to the public involvement requirements. So there was a public involvement plan request on the part of the city in 2006, some initial action taken by Sunoco to fulfill that, and then that work lapsed. So through that period, 2011 on, in which Sunoco and Evergreen were submitting those reports, they neglected to include public involvement. And we came to the realization of this last year, worked with the city and Evergreen to find solutions to that. And what Evergreen has done is created a new public involvement plan. They created the website that I mentioned, and they're going to hold a public meeting later this fall, likely in November, and that is going to open up a new public comment period. That will last 120 days, so it'll go into the spring, and at that time they will hold a second public meeting to take additional comment and close that comment period. They still need to make that correction through Act 2, and they'll submit a remedial investigation report addendum to the state that will compile all the public comments and respond to them, and we'll need to consider that information and make a decision on how they move forward. As they move through those additional steps I described in the previous slide, the additional reports they're going to need to submit, each of those will need to accommodate public comment. There's active remediation shown by these circles. That is ongoing. There's still contamination that's being recovered. And to wrap up, so the key cleanup issues from the perspective of DEP and the cleanup of the facility. A first point is that the refinery has a deed restriction under this buyer-seller agreement between PES, Sunoco, and Pennsylvania that requires only commercial or industrial use. Evergreen's responsibility under that buyer-seller agreement is to clean up only to a non-residential standard for commercial or industrial use. They are under no obligation to clean it up to a higher standard. There's one exception to that. In the northwest corner of the refinery, in the north yard, there's a baseball field. And in that location, they need to clean up to a residential standard because under Act 2, a recreational use is deemed a residential use. Evergreen is aware of this, and they have been proceeding with cleaning up that area to a residential use. Second point, all the work that's been going on the last 30 years has been under conditions of an operating refinery. And that has meant that there have been some areas that have not been investigated because it isn't safe to put drill rigs in and do borings in places where operating units are active. So an implication of a permanent shutdown of the refinery is that Evergreen would need to come back, and as areas are dismantled, as process units open up to investigation, they would have to come back and do further work. So that will also have implications for their schedule, for getting the project done, and also costs, of course. As I mentioned, PES has some responsibilities for contamination that they've caused. Now, to the best of our knowledge, any releases in the last 7 years are really minimal compared to the legacy contamination here. But there have been some, and it is not clear right now, given that PES is in bankruptcy, what party is going to be stepping forward to deal with that cleanup. That's separate from Evergreen's responsibility. Evergreen is continuing on. We will be soon going into this public comment phase, and some of those comments may also change the direction of the work. It may require additional work, and that remains to be seen. There's a lot of uncertainty for Evergreen right now because, again, they were headed down this road of meeting a cleanup standard for an operating refinery. And right now, we don't know if that operation is going to resume or if it's going to be something else entirely. So that's going to affect their risk assessment because how they calculate that risk assessment depends on who's being exposed to the contamination. They also have this 2020 deadline, and they're not going to be able to meet that at this point because of the reports that they have in front of them, and so that's going to need to be extended. The buyer-seller agreement allows for that. So a couple final questions. How does Pennsylvania's Act 2 program constrain the future uses? Well, Evergreen needs to clean it up for the current and the planned future use, and there's some uncertainty there. But Act 2 does not preclude cleaning it up to a higher standard, up to and including a residential use or a recreational use. But Evergreen isn't going to do that. So if other parties were to take ownership and needed to clean it up to a higher use, then that would be their responsibility. And then the final question is the buyer-seller agreement. Again, this has this restriction for commercial industrial use. If that use was to change to something else, all three parties would need to agree to it: PES, Evergreen, and the state. The EPA project officer is Kevin Bylash, and I don't think he's here this evening, but EPA asked that we provide their contact information, and this presentation is going to be posted on the advisory group website, so it should be available tomorrow. The links in here will be available from the PDF. Contact information for EPA, and then mine as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Just want to reiterate that entire presentation will be on the website available. You'll be able to click the links and go to some of the sources of information as well. Now we'll hear from the city's health commissioner, Thomas Farley, who's coming to the podium. Questions that you have about either of these presentations should be sent into the city's refinery website. That's the email address. They'll be forwarded to us on the committee, and we will attend to answers. We've got lots of seats on this side for those of you who would rather sit than stand.
All right, good evening. I was asked to talk about air pollution in Philadelphia, how we monitor it, how we regulate it, and the contribution of the refinery to air pollution in the city. So I'm going to do that. Now, I recognize that in the crowds we have here tonight, there's a real range of backgrounds. We have people here who are national experts on air pollution. There are other people who are concerned citizens who don't have the same background. So I'm going to try to back up and give some basic vocabulary about air pollution so people understand where we're coming from for future conversations. So first, general different types of air pollution. We think of it in different categories. There are what the EPA has classified as criteria pollutants. These are the criteria they use for measuring whether a city is in compliance with national standards. Those include fine particles, very tiny flecks of air pollution that can get down into your lungs and cause disease. Those fine particles are important. I'm going to come back to them a couple times. They come in two sizes. There's PM 2.5 and PM 10. The 2.5 is smaller than the 10 and probably gets down to your lungs and causes more damage. Then there are also gases as criteria pollutants: nitrogen dioxide, ozone, carbon monoxide, and sulfur dioxide. There's also lead. These, in general, are harmful to health. That's why we are so concerned about those. That's why they're part of the criteria. They, in particular, they cause heart and lung disease, and they've been associated with reduced life expectancy at the citywide level. So these are important to someone like myself, who is not an air pollution expert but cares enough about health to be concerned with these issues. And in general, these are produced by combustion, by some sort of burning of something, by particularly burning of fuels, and they come from two different types of sources. There are stationary sources, like a factory or like a refinery, building furnaces, things in buildings where they have boilers. And then there are mobile sources, like the things that we got here on with cars and trucks and buses, as well as planes and ships. I'm going to come back to those different sources in a minute. Separate category of air pollutants are what's referred to as air toxics. These are chemicals that may have long-term risks for things like cancer or other biologic effects or other environmental effects that are produced less so much from burning and more so from chemical releases, such as a gasoline station, dry cleaners, or a refinery. And there's a third category of things that we care about, and those are greenhouse gases. These are things like carbon dioxide and methane, which contribute to global warming and climate change, and that obviously have been brought to our attention because of the real problems and real risks of climate change these days. And these in general are produced by the burning of fossil fuels. So I want to talk about those in sort of separately. Big picture about air quality in Philadelphia. It is worth remembering that our air quality is a lot better than it was in the days before we started regulating this. This is a picture here on the left from 1962, before the EPA was in existence, at South Broad Street compared to what it looked like in the 2010s. And you can see that there's this black haze there. It makes it difficult to see City Hall. That is probably particulate matter, PM, and that was particularly bad for health. So we are making an awful lot of progress in health. We need further to go, but we have made a lot of progress in air pollution through the regulatory systems that we have in place. It does take years, though. Here's how we monitor air pollution in the city of Philadelphia. In that map there on the left are red dots. Each of those dots represents a monitoring station, and each of those stations measures different of the pollutants that I talked about on the slide earlier. Some of them measure quite a few, some of them measure just a couple. And they're designed not so much to measure what's happening in that neighborhood, but rather what's happening to the city as a whole. In the city as a whole, this is what's happening overall to our levels of PM 2.5, those fine particles that have clear human health effects. Big picture here is that these air pollution levels are falling. That's good. If you go back to 2001 on the left-hand side of the graph there, our average PM 2.5 was around 16. We're down in 2018 at about 8.3. So we've dropped almost in half over this time period. We still have further to go. The lower this is, the better it is for human health. The red line there is the National Air Quality Standard. This is what EPA requires cities to get to, and we are below the standard for PM 2.5, which is a good thing. But again, lower still would be better. We are below these national air quality standards for all of the criteria air pollutants except for one, and that is ozone. Ozone is a more complicated air pollutant than the others. It is produced as a secondary pollutant from other sources, and it can be the result of sources that are generated well outside of the city. Our ozone levels, like the levels of PM 2.5, are falling, but we are just above the national standard at this point. The national standards for both of these, for all of these, tend to be ratcheted down over time as cities make improvements. So our ozone level is somewhere at the 0.8 level, and the national standard now is 0.07. So now let me those are citywide levels. Now let me talk about the refinery itself. This is a picture of what you've seen before in the paper. The there's an awful lot of sources of air pollution in any sort of big operation like this, any big industrial operation. I don't know what all these are, but all these can produce a variety of different pollutants. And Air Management Services is a unit of the health department that is given responsibility through delegation from the EPA and the State Department of Environmental Protection to inspect and monitor air pollution emissions from PES and other sources in the city. This is how we do that. They do what are called stack tests, which is measuring the amount of emissions of air pollution. Whenever any new source, like those sources on the last slides, are installed, or if they're modified, and generally about every 5 years. In addition, a number of these sources have what are called continuous emission monitors. They measure on a continuous basis what those sources are producing. And they submit quarterly reports to Air Management Services at the Health Department, which then passes them up to DEP and to the EPA. And then there are inspections that our agency does, as well as inspections that EPA does, and sometimes there are joint inspections. In addition, the refinery is required to have what's called fence line monitors. Those are monitors on the site that measure air pollution levels in the air that are on the site, including monitoring the criteria pollutants that I mentioned earlier, as well as benzene. Now, I asked a very simple sort of layman's question to my staff in Air Management Services. And that is, say, we know that the refinery generates air pollution. Any industrial site like that's going to generate air pollution. Can you put that in context, I said? Can you give me a sense of how much it puts out compared to, say, other sources in the city? And so based on that, they came up with some estimates I want to show you here. I want to preface that by saying these are estimates. These are not hard numbers. And these are sort of the first take. But to give you some sense of the amount of total pollutants that come out from that source relative to other sources in the city. So first, looking at fine particle pollution, PM 2.5, on the left there, what you can see is that the largest majority of sources of that in the city are mobile sources, about 86%. So cars, trucks, buses, ships, and planes. So that's the biggest source. On the other hand, among stationary sources, PES is large. And overall, PES, by this estimate, was responsible for about 9% of the PM 2.5 in the city. For greenhouse gases, similarly, mobile sources were the biggest source overall, 72%, but PES was responsible for about 20% of the emissions total in the city of Philadelphia. Now let me talk a little bit about our monitoring near the site and about the incident in particular where we had the fire and the explosion. One of the monitoring stations we have in the city is at 24th and Rittner, which is very close to PES. You can see there on the map. And in that site, we can monitors a number of pollutants over time. This is its monitoring of PM 2.5 going back to 2014, with a line here for each day during that time period. So a few things I want to draw your attention to. First, overall, it doesn't show it easily seen, but there's been a decline in this over time. So we were in the 15 to 20 range back in 2014. Now here at 2009, we're in the 5 to 10 range. You also see that it changes an awful lot day to day. There's a lot of variation day to day for a variety of different factors, maybe that I don't fully understand. And the third thing to point out is that the fire and explosion happened right near the very end of that, just in a few days before the end of that graph. And it doesn't show up as a particular spike any more than the ordinary day-to-day variation. Now, that's a graph that's looking across a number of years. And so I asked, well, what happens if we look at it just in the hours around the explosion? And this is the data we have. The blue line there measures PM 2.5 at a fence line monitor that was made publicly available by PES on their site. And it showed an increase in PM 2.5 right around the time of explosion. Not a surprise. There's going to be smoke there at that time. The red line there is the PM 2.5 measured in that station at 24th and Rittner, which, if it showed any increase at all, it was pretty minor. And then the green line is data that was made available by the New Jersey Department of, whatever department measures this, in Camden, and it shows, if there's any increase at all, it wasn't much. So not much in the way of PM 2.5 measured in the neighborhoods, although there was a spike in probably smoke related to the fire and the explosion. We also measured around the time of the fire and explosion a few samples of air and measured these air toxics, and in general didn't find anything. to a couple of very trace levels of acetone and ethanol, not anywhere near enough for human health effects. So no indicator from the measurements that we had that the fire and the explosion caused any greater pollution than what we have ordinarily. So that's in general what we have been doing on air monitoring. I want to talk about a new system we have for air monitoring that is going to be giving us more information in the future, which is going to be useful. This is the Philadelphia Air Quality Survey. I showed you earlier that there have been about 10 different monitoring sites across the city. With this survey, we're going to have 50 sites of monitoring across the city with these monitors like this that are mounted on light poles. There's not 50 monitors at any one time. There's less than that, but over time we move them across the different stations. And by sampling in space and time and putting that into a computer model, we can estimate much better air pollution levels at the neighborhood level. Whereas up until now, much of our information really was at the citywide level. The monitor on the right is shown next to City Hall. I'm going to bring that back in a minute. So we're just now getting the very first results of the Philadelphia Air Quality Survey measuring PM 2.5 across the city. This map doesn't show up very well, but I want to just highlight a couple points in it. The blue box there is approximately where the refinery is. And the overall citywide average PM 2.5 is 8.1, pretty much the same as we got when we measured from the other monitors. The highest level is at City Hall, 10.4, pretty much where I work, probably because that's where an awful lot of vehicle pollution is, an awful lot of vehicles in Center City. Lowest levels up here in Roxborough, where there are an awful lot of vehicles, not an awful lot of industrial sources. Here, just east of the refinery at 24th and Rittner, we got a level of 7.9, and Southwest is level of 8.3, so pretty much at the citywide average. Not to say that it's not contributing, that the refinery is not contributing to PM 2.5, but we don't see increased levels in the neighborhood immediately around the refinery compared to other areas of the average area in the city. So, in summary, air pollution levels are far lower than they were previously, but clearly further improvements would obviously help human health. PES is a significant source of air pollution and greenhouse gases in Philadelphia. Now, mobile sources, vehicles and equipment, are cumulatively far greater, but nonetheless, PES is a significant source. Levels of PM 2.5 in the neighborhoods near PES are similar to the citywide average. And there's no evidence that the fire and explosion, that particular event, made things any different, that increased levels of air pollution around the particular neighborhoods around PES. I will stop right there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all. 6 o'clock. We have 28 speakers scheduled. Now that we're all here together, I think, probably. I want to repeat the offer to sign up with my colleague, Molly Simon, at the end of the table there. She has a clipboard for anyone who would like to reserve a spot if there is time between our last speaker and 8:30 when we must leave the room. So we've had 2 long, informative, authoritative presentations from government, right, from the city and the state. Now we're going to both change the pace and we're going to change the speakers. We're going to turn to a set of public speakers now who will speak for a shorter period of time and on a very wide variety of topics. I ask, the managing director has already stated the importance of respectful listening in a session like this and in a big room like this. I would just like to reiterate that and also note one thing, that it takes a lot of courage to speak in a big room like this, whether the room is with you or against you. I would also invite the rest of the audience to think about it takes a lot of courage to really listen on a divided topic like this. So there is courage required of everyone in this room, and I am confident that we can count on that. So thank you in advance for a respectful and courageous session of listening tonight. I will, out of kind of a sense of inclusiveness, I will not use titles as I call speakers to the table. Bill, are you ready? We have a little helpful device here rather than me saying this at some point where it feels like I should. talking about controlling the time of each speaker. We have a little device here that will go off with a pleasant sound at 3 minutes. He was all set up. And that is the sound you'll hear at 5 minutes. The 3-minute sound is even more pleasant, all right? So please wrap up your comments as close as you can to 3 minutes. That's the happy one. When you hear the sad 3 minutes, you really need to stop speaking, and I will encourage you if you need it. Hopefully you will be done by then, as soon as the 3-minute sound dings. So I'm also, in order to facilitate the speed, I'm going to ask speakers to come up 2 at a time so that we can kind of cut down on turnover time. Before we begin, though, I want to, in the spirit of previous meetings, ask my colleagues on the committee and on the rest of the advisory group if you would have anything you'd like to say at the beginning. If not, then we're going to jump right in. Our first speaker is Gregory Holston, and he will be followed by Carrie Colonese. And when Carrie sits down, I will invite the following speaker up.
My name is Reverend Gregory Holston. I'm the Executive Director of POWER. POWER is now 83 congregations across the city of Philadelphia and surrounding areas, and now organizing in the center of the state, building communities of opportunity that work for all. Racial justice is at the center of our work, and faith is the foundation of everything we do. Besides being the Executive Director of POWER, I was a longtime resident in this community. I grew up here. Church of Redeemer Baptist is my home church, which is only about 4 blocks down the street. I went to middle school right over here at Vare Middle School, which was Vare Junior High School when I was there. I taught at Orden Reed High School, and so I'm very familiar with this community. But even more so, I'm familiar with this refinery. My grandfather, when he came up from the South and brought his 7 kids with him, his first job, and really the job he had for 30 years, was working right at this refinery, dealing with the oil tanks. And the little check we receive as grandchildren are from his retirement from this plant. And so I'm very familiar with this refinery, and I'm very familiar with its effects in our community. And so I'm very sensitive to all of the workers, many who have been working there for years, about this plant closing and what it means to them. I know the importance of this plant. As my grandfather raised his 7 kids and put 3 of them in college because of this refinery. But I always say that if my grandfather understood how his own children were affected by the pollutants that have come out of this plant, he would have quit his job. He loved his children much more than he loved the job. And the reality is that as I lived in this community, my own daughter, his grandchild, suffered from asthma in this community for the first 12 years of her life. Every day, or many, many days, we were there at her bedside, or we were in the hospital because she simply could not breathe. Very skinny, very frail. So almost every muscle in her body would squeeze to gas the air that she needed to be able to breathe. We just simply thought it was asthma. I mean, children have asthma. What's the big deal? Even though we saw that this refinery would let out gases every day in our community. Well, when we were 12 years old, she was 12 years old, we had managed to move out of the community, move to New Jersey. And from that day forward, she never had asthma again. Not one machine did she ever have to use. And now she's a beautiful 27-year-old lady who had never had any asthma problem again. The reality is that this plant, that as the health people just said, has substantial greenhouse effects, causes asthma. The higher rates of asthma in this community and even cancer rates in this community has to be directly because of this plant. It cannot be simply just because of the motor vehicles in this area. No, this plant has caused problems. It has taken lives. And as a pastor who has lived, now also worked at the Church of Redeemer Baptist, and has buried many people with strange cancers in this community, we demand that this plant never open up again. But we also say, because I've stood as an executive director with Power from workers at the airport, from workers at Marriott hotels, I've stood with workers all over this city. I have gotten up and stood on the front line for workers to get better wages, to get health care, to protect their jobs. We also have to say there has to be a just transition for these workers. They deserve health care. They deserve not to be thrown out like they're nothing and nobody. They deserve to have life, and they deserve to have that kind of life. And we need to find a way to provide for these workers.
Thank you. I'll ask Sharmar Pitts to approach the witness table. Thank you, Gary.
Good evening. Thank you to the advisory group for the opportunity to be here to present to you today. My name is Kerry Colanisi. I am a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where I also direct the Penn Program on Regulation. And at the outset, I'd also like to express my appreciation for all of the refinery workers and all of the first responders who made sure that there was no loss of life in June. Really appreciate that. What will the future of the refinery site look like? That's the question the advisory group is contemplating and that we're all here wondering about. I can't tell you that. It's impossible to forecast with any precision, but I can say one thing is for certain. The future will involve complexities, uncertainties. It will involve change. It will involve trade-offs. It will involve value choices, some of them very difficult to make. This is not entirely unique. As someone who has spent the last quarter century researching regulation, and particularly environmental health and safety regulation, I can say that complexities, uncertainties, change, and trade-offs and value choices are found throughout so many different public policy problems that we face in society. And it is possible to address these uncertainties and complexities and the change and value choices responsibly and with excellence, with quality by our government officials. For the last 5 years or so, we've been conducting a project on regulatory excellence at the Penn Program on Regulation, and we've been writing about how regulators can act with integrity, with competence, and with empathy. And when they do, they can be successful, and the city can be successful going forward. It doesn't mean the road will be easy at all, but I think there's three important features of the future that the city needs to confront and responsibilities that it needs to pursue. What are those three responsibilities? First is coordination. The future of the refinery site is not up to the city alone, certainly. It is a private property. It is owned by private businesses. The private sector will play an important role in the future of the site. The city will obviously play an important role in the public sector, but not the only role. The federal government and state governments will be primary actors going forward. The city should have a responsibility to coordinate, though. And second responsibility is with respect to communication, public communication in particular. And this hearing is a good first step, and all of the hearings and the work of the advisory group are good first steps. Communication works best with the public when it's conversational, not just a one-way street. And I would urge the advisory group and the city at the end of the hearings and the processes that you undertake to communicate back to the public about what you have heard here. And the city should take on that responsibility going forward to keep an open line of communication to all of the affected individuals and communities. And third and last, but not least, is compassion. This is a difficult circumstance for the city and for all of those who are affected. There's a lot at stake for the future. And all those who will be affected deserve respect and empathy. I applaud the work that you're doing. I thank you for the time to be here to share with you. Ultimately, as difficult as the road may be ahead, by pursuing excellence and thinking about integrity, competence, and empathy, coordination, communication, and compassion, the city can lead to a brighter future for all. Thank you very much.
Mr. Pitts? Yes? Is that you? Thank you. Hi. Please. And are you Shamar Pitts? Yeah, please. Thank you. And Marilyn Howarth, if you could approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone present. Thank you for coming. First and foremost, I would like to apologize for not being able to make the prior meetings. Unfortunately, I had to work, and I could not get away from those obligations, which is directly related to what I wanted to shed some light upon in this moment, work. Although I didn't have a chance to be here last week, I heard that some people had things misconstrued. Word got back to me that some employees from the refinery, dedicated, hard-working people, they had the perception that Philly Thrive was against them keeping their jobs. Philly Thrive was not sympathetic to their livelihood being snatched away from them. There's nothing further from the reality of what is going on. Philly Thrive don't rock like that. We are an organization dedicated to protecting the rights of the people, and working hard to provide for your family is a right that should never be denied. There is no way any rational thinking person could be happy with someone being denied the work they need to sustain their family. We know there's no way a community can thrive without hard work. There's also no way a community can thrive if it has been denied the right to clean air, clean water, and a clean environment. We are suffering in our community from being denied. Over the years, we have been denied so many things, I can't even count them all. We have been denied good schools so that we could get educations. We are getting a little better with that, but we still need to strive because we are still being denied. We have been denied the opportunity of so many things, civil rights, human rights, all kind of rights. We have even been denied the right to breathe. This is such a complicated issue because we have been subjected to a silent killer for so long. It is different than a mass murderer or a serial killer. When you have an individual who is harming innocent people, everyone stands up against that to make certain that individual is stopped. The community is made safe from their violence. But when it is a silent killer, everyone is unaware of it. People are just subjected to it and affected by it, made sick by it, and die from it without even know what hit them. The facts are irrefutable. We as a community have been crushed by the overwhelming amount of cases of cancer, lung diseases, and sicknesses that come from poor air quality and living in a contaminated environment. We have the statistics for anyone who wants to pay attention. We are now being awakened by the statistics, not just the statistics of our communities on a local or citywide level, but all over the world. The planet is giving us the signs that we have to change our ways and that it is impossible for the earth to be so greatly abused and stay habitable. Climate change is happening, and the scientific community worldwide have closely studied the causes and effects of this situation we find ourselves in. The ill effects of greenhouse gas emissions into our atmosphere cannot be denied. It is a known fact that we have to change the ways we get and use our energy. There has to be a new industrial revolution. Our situation in South Philly with the closing of PES is our opportunity to be trailblazers in saving the planet, one community at a time. We have the need for skilled workers to make the transition from fossil fuels that destroy the environment to clean energy that will not harm the environment. The land that PES sits on needs to be decontaminated and cleaned up. Why can't the same hard-working people who have been working there for years be paid the same wages they earned when the refinery were polluting everything and giving people cancer? Why can't they earn the same money making it environmentally safe? The energy companies know it. The whole world knows it. So why is it so hard for those in authority to act now? Stand up for everyone, the communities at large, the workers, and the environment, and go to the city, the state, and federal officials, all the smart people who are supposed to protect us, enact legislation, allocate the funds, and do everything needed to develop clean energy and spearhead the new clean energy industrial revolution right here in South Philly. They can start with cleaning up that environmental landmine that already blew up. Call the unions and negotiate a new deal for the workers, collective bargaining. Sure, all past companies pay them for the cleanup of the entire refinery, then get the companies who are developing solar, wind, and other clean energy the same government subsidies the oil and gas industries have been enjoying for decades. So, ladies and gentlemen, on the advisory board, please give precedence to the statistics and carefully consider how to correct what is wrong. Thank you.
But just before you start, Marilyn, please, I'll ask Charles Ellison, please, to step up to the table as well while Dr. Howarth begins.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Marilyn Howarth, an occupational and environmental medicine physician and Director of Community Engagement at the Center of Excellence in Environmental Toxicology at the Perelman School of Medicine of the University of Pennsylvania. I'd like to thank the Environment Committee of the Refinery Advisory Group for the opportunity to submit this testimony regarding the environmental health impacts of PES Refinery, the refinery fire, its shutdown, and potential reuse of the site. The Center of Excellence in Environmental Toxicology is an environmental health sciences core center funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. It's the only environmental health sciences core center in Pennsylvania and the only one in EPA Region 3. The environmental health researchers, physicians, and public health professionals of SEAT work every day on environmental health issues that affect our region and recognize the value of scientific evidence to establish and maintain public policy protective of human health. I refer you to my full written testimony for additional detail, but to appreciate the impact of the PES refinery on the health of Philadelphia residents requires background on the health outcomes that are relevant to its emissions and releases. The National Cancer Institute estimates that Philadelphia has the highest cancer rate of any large city in the United States. 541 people in every 100,000 in Philadelphia every year will get cancer, compared with 442 in the United States and 494 in Pennsylvania. The refinery pollutant benzene is linked to leukemia and kidney cancer, and particulates are linked to lung cancer. The International Agency for Research on Cancer has listed air pollution as a Group 1 known carcinogen and estimates that it contributes to 230,000 new lung cancer cases every year in the world. Asthma hospitalization rates are 3 times higher in Philadelphia than Pennsylvania, and so too are Philadelphia's rates of hospitalization for heart attacks and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Certainly, there are many contributors to each of these health outcomes. However, the volatile organic chemical compounds and particulates emanating from the PES refinery significantly increase the exposure to hazardous air pollutants to residents of Philadelphia and the environs. The PES refinery is the largest emitter of volatile organic chemicals, something Dr. Farley did not have on one of his pie charts. The volatile organics are the hazardous pollutants that we're most concerned about for cancer. More than 400,000 pounds of hazardous chemicals are emitted into the Philadelphia air every year. More than 10% of the emissions are carcinogens or pre-carcinogens, changed into carcinogens in our bodies. In 1999, a health assessment conducted for the EPA found that lung cancer incidence in the proximity of the refinery was 40% higher than the national average. Since the passage of the Federal Clean Air Act in 1970, Philadelphia has never been in compliance with the national ambient air quality standards, and ozone is formed in large part from the volatile organic chemicals that emanate from the refinery. Ozone is a potent irritant that causes asthma and leads to asthma exacerbations in people who already have asthma. As little as 1 to 2 hours of elevated levels of ozone exposure increases heart attack rates and heart rhythm disturbances that lead to sudden death. The closure of the refinery alone would substantially improve the ozone levels in Philadelphia, leading to improved regional compliance with the Clean Air Act and reduced asthma hospitalizations and heart attacks. Replacing the refinery with a similarly polluting industrial process will pose substantial health risks to Philadelphia residents. Surely we can preserve jobs while avoiding the cost of providing health care for chronic illness and lost days at work or school due to that illness, borne by some of the most vulnerable residents, our children, the sick, and the elderly. The recent fires of the PES refinery have led to many questions about the preparedness of Philadelphia air management to quickly identify airborne hazards and adequately protect people. Immediate community-level monitoring should be in place, in particular when the emissions could have been catastrophic in their health consequences, such as with hydrofluoric acid, a deadly chemical known to travel for several miles from the emission source. Had there been a substantial HF leak at PES, many residents would have been exposed, leading to permanent lung damage and possibly death. Legacy pollution at the PES refinery location must be considered in the plans for future use of the site and the potential for ongoing health impacts to people. The Philadelphia community has not been involved in the evaluation of the remediation plans or the establishment of cleanup levels as Act 2 requires. Philadelphia residents have a right to know about the important health implications of the decisions being made on their behalf. In summary, we're very concerned about the large-scale contribution of PES refinery emissions to cancer, lung, and heart disease in Philadelphia residents. We hope that recognition of these significant health impacts informs decisions regarding the use of this property. We are concerned about the ineffectual air monitoring in neighborhoods during the fire at the PES refinery that could have led to serious public health consequences. We recommend that cleanup levels at the property committing it to industrial use for the foreseeable future be reconsidered because large-scale industry in proximity to densely populated Philadelphia neighborhoods may pose undue risk to public health. We also strongly recommend that the city insist that public participation by residents in the process be enhanced as the remediation plans are developed. We would gladly bring scientific expertise and join community members to allow for improved public engagement.
Thank you, Ms.
Thank you for the
Haworth.
opportunity.
Thank you. After Mr. Ellison speaks, Andrea Welker, please walk up to the table.
Good evening. My name is Charles Ellison. I grew up in North Philadelphia. I am the creator, host, and executive producer of a program called Reality Check on WURD Radio, and I'm also a contributing editor to the Philadelphia Citizen. I want to thank everyone here for the opportunity to explore what happens next at the Philadelphia Energy Solutions Oil Refinery site. Hopefully, these conversations can create an optimal quality of life model that sets an example for our region and the rest of the nation. What does it mean to live, work, provide, and prosper in a clean, just, and safe environment for ourselves, our families, our neighbors, and our children? The PES refinery should remain shut down permanently. While the circumstances which led to its demise are spectacular and unfortunate, we should feel fortunate that the city's #1 air polluter is finally out of operation. We can easily reflect on just how bad that refinery was for the people who lived around it, including my late mother, and the entire city that suffered from it. But it's now time to create an opportunity to really innovate for a clean energy and completely healthy future. We must first be completely honest with ourselves as a city, as neighbors, that this refinery is a prime example of the disproportionate exposure of vulnerable, mostly black populations to heavy polluting chemical and fossil fuel sites. This is a national trend. Philly has an opportunity to defy that trend by keeping the refinery shut down. City officials are giving enormous consideration to the solvency of PES, the small economy of local businesses around it, and the 1,000 or so employees who have worked there. But city priority, government priority, should always be the health and safety of residents and alleviating the years of personal, emotional, and economic cost communities within living distance of that site suffered as a result of the refinery's operation. The workers at the refinery can easily transition elsewhere into the region's alarmingly growing natural gas sector throughout this region, or even better, easily transfer their skills and expertise towards building a new clean energy infrastructure throughout Philadelphia. But the countless lives of those suffering or now passed on from respiratory illness, asthma, cancer, such as what my mother suffered, and other chronic public health conditions cannot be replaced. We should not consider the revival of a place that is responsible for, as a national NAACP report noted, 72% of toxic air emissions in Philadelphia, that owes billions in taxes and has for years flagrantly defied Clean Air Act standards. The mayor boasts that his goal is to have Philly completely run on renewable or clean energy by 2030. Yet he allows the expansion of more methane-leaking natural gas infrastructure through projects such as the SEPTA natural gas plant in North Philly and the PGW natural gas plant in Southwest Philly, while still open to the hope that the PES refinery is resurrected into more unhealthy natural gas in the future. How do you completely go renewable energy in 20 years while at the same time your city continues to choke on fossil fuel pollution? Keep the refinery shut down. There are no trade-offs, as I heard earlier stated. It is simply the will and the resources to bring a new vision to Philly. Clean it up. Transition the site into a fully operational solar or wind energy farm that powers the city versus killing it. Calculate the taxes owed by PES and potential restitution for sick residents. Turn this into a major economic power play for Philly that puts it on a global map while using it as the impetus for an ambitious and successful 21st century green economy that puts Philly's unemployed, underemployed, and vulnerable to work. Don't show the world what Philly has always been bad at. Show the world what a creative, innovative, and sensible Philly can be its best at. But whatever we do as a city, make sure we keep the current refinery shut down and don't ever build anything like it ever again.
Thank you, Mr. Ellison. I'd invite Carol White to approach the table, and I would implore speakers to stay as much under the 5-minute time limit as they can, at least on average. We've had a couple over, so let's have a couple under, please, and we'll be okay. Ms. Welker.
Great, thank you. My name is Dr. Andrea Welker. I'm a professional engineer in the state of Pennsylvania. I'm also the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. Get closer? Okay, I'll start over. So I am Dr. Andrea Welker. I am a professional engineer in the state of Pennsylvania. I'm also Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and a professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Villanova University. I conduct quite a bit of research with the Villanova Center for Resilient Water Systems, and specifically I've been asked to come to provide some commentary on some of the water quality challenges at the Philadelphia Energy Solutions site, specifically focusing on stormwater, climate change impacts, and the aquifer there. So we had the opportunity earlier to hear from the DEP, and that provided quite a bit of context to some of my commentary. It's quite obvious from looking at the location of the site that it's located right next to these two major waterways. That also indicates then that the water table is going to be very shallow at the surface. Also, because of the tidal nature of the Delaware River, we are also likely to see fluctuations in the groundwater table over time and over the course of a day even as the day moves on. As we also heard about, there's a little bit of uncertainty, or I should say a lot of uncertainty about the deep aquifer at the site and what the level of contamination is there. Based on that, I don't feel quite comfortable giving a professional recommendation on the deep aquifer. However, there is significant information available on the shallow aquifer. We heard quite a bit about LNAPLs earlier, or light non-aqueous phase liquids, right? So to think about that, that would be, for those of you that weren't here earlier, if we think about oil and vinegar in our salad dressing, right, the oil is on top, the vinegar is on the bottom, and in some ways, as far as contamination goes, that's one of the quote-unquote easier contaminants to clean up. That is not to say that it's easy. It is easier than, say, a dense non-aqueous phase liquid. There's quite a bit of remediation that's occurred on the site already, and the primary thing that's happening there is what we consider hydraulic containment, where there's a lot of pump and treat occurring over time, trying to either remove the contaminants or at least prevent them from entering the nearby waterways. My primary concern for this site as far as the future goes, so thinking forward to the future and what this might look like at the site, thinking about stormwater, right, we would not want to have any more contamination at the site. So any stormwater that we try to control on site, we need to have line facilities with a slow release mechanism so as not to further contaminate the water that fell on the site, and also we would not want to add to the contaminated soil or water underneath of the location. The other key thing is that given its location, it is significantly vulnerable to climate change impacts, and flooding would have to be something very much considered in the future. The last thing that I want to add about the future of the site is that considering its very long industrial use, minimizing contact of the soil with the public in the future is really a major goal, right? So when we think about what could be there in the future, clearly something where we don't have humans in direct contact with the soil should be the major goal of any future use of the site. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Welker. I appreciate the timeliness. Ms. White, and I'll ask Pune Sabiri to approach the table. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Carol White. I'm on the fence line of the refinery. I'm on the fence line of the refinery right across the street. We talk about having proof when the refinery comes to causing cancer. The World Health Organization has stated that the particulate matter pollution known as PM 2.5 in the air causes cancer, particularly of the lungs. Philadelphia Energy Solution Refinery has been the largest stationary source of PM 2.5 pollution in the city by far. In 2016, PES admitted that 520 tons of PM 2.5 pollutions, the next largest polluter, produced only 1/10 as much as PES. The National Cancer Institute estimated that Philadelphia has the highest cancer rate in any large city in the United States. A study conducted 10 years ago by the EPA found that lung cancer incidents near the refinery were 40% higher than the national average. Now let's talk about the proof when it comes to refinery causing asthma. The EPA has concluded that asthma made worse by ozone. Ozone is found in chemical reactions that take place when volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxide are exposed to sunlight. The refinery is also the largest stationary source of this pollutant. In 2019, a report that Asthma and Allergies Foundation of America ranked Philadelphia number 4 for the asthma capital of this country. Philly was the only one out of 100 cities to rank worse than average. In all three categories, asthma, death rates, and asthma for ER visits for asthma. I'm going to say something about myself because I was affected by the last explosion. I'm very emotional about it because I never had asthma before, and I lived here for over 16 years. The last explosion, this is all I take now today. My eye irritations, medications, my asthma medications, Benadryl for my eye itching. It caused me to run to the hospital at the very first explosion. I couldn't breathe. Went to the emergency room, they gave me 3 asthma treatments, antibiotics, and I got like 2 needles. I don't know what they were for, but I knew it helped me breathe better. I sit here and knowing that living in South Philadelphia on Banbury Terrace, steps away from the refinery, I've lost so many people just in my one block. My senior citizens have the high rise, and the higher they up, the more pollution went into their windows. I like to say that I did also speak to some people that worked at the refinery that also caused them a lot of illnesses, that they no longer work there anymore. So I just like to say that Philly Thrive will not stop fighting against this cause, because we're here to save lives, not kill lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. White. Also, the gratefulness from the chair for staying under your time limit. I appreciate that very much. Before Ms. Saberi starts, I will ask Joe Minot to approach the table, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Got it, okay. My name is Pune Saberi, and I'm a physician in occupational and environmental medicine. In my medical specialty, I see firsthand the negative health impacts of job loss on a person and their family. But also in my medical specialty, I see the negative health impacts of air and water pollution on people and communities. I am here tonight wearing my hat as the board president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, a local health-based nonprofit on behalf of Dr. Kenneth Landy, Professor Emeritus of Physics at University of Pennsylvania. We want to highlight a solution that will bring economic prosperity without worsening environmental pollution. We propose that the present PES site be converted into an offshore wind turbine manufacturing, assembly, and maintenance facility. Offshore wind turbine farms are the most appropriate and feasible renewable energy generating systems for high population density coastal regions such as the Mid-Atlantic. In 2015, a report by Department of Energy projected that the Mid-Atlantic offshore wind turbine industry will create 24,300 long-term construction jobs, 2,400 maintenance and operation jobs, and thousands of supply chain jobs. The Delaware River Bay region can end up with 1/3 to 1/2 of that projected effort. The size of the site and the geography of the location are also ideal. Wind turbines can be massive. Their large-scale construction requires vast spaces and are difficult to move on land. Their construction requires large spaces and then transported by ship. Of the 3 possible ports in the Northeast Corridor, the current PES site has the most favorable conditions for this manufacturing industry. Given the promise of this new industry, clearly we're not the only ones thinking about this possibility. There is competition. In fact, I think about where we would have been if the city had the vision to act on this back in 2015. The people who have lost their jobs need help to transition to new industries. This transition must include health benefits and training for new skills. If the city had started a just transition in 2015, the year U.S. entered the Paris Climate Agreement, both the job and environmental prospects of our city would have been much more positive. With the increase in demand in electricity, this region would have been in prime position to meet that need. As an environmental health physician, I am worried about the cleanup of water and soil pollutants at the PES site. U.S. environmental laws would dictate that polluters pay. I am discouraged by the lack of transparency about how PES is going to be held accountable for comprehensive and thorough cleanup at the site. Lastly, as a Philadelphia resident who lives within the 5-mile radius of the site, I want my neighbors, neighborhood, and city to have clean air and not be threatened by the explosion of an extremely dangerous chemical. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today and can only hope the city will truly act on its promise to hear us, and I can provide the advisory group the full documentation of the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Severi. Thank you very much, and we are on a time management roll. Joe Minot will now speak, and as he does, I'd ask James Hines to approach the table, please.
I'm a little hard of hearing. I may not hear the
Well, when I stand up and wave, that's
okay, I'll wave back
a visual cue.
My name is Joe Minot, and I am the Executive Director and Chief Counsel of the Clean Air Council. I confess to not understanding the purpose of the Refinery Advisory Group. The cynic in me suspects it is mere window dressing to show the public that city leaders are doing something. But are they? So far, the pronouncements from city officials have been discouraging. We've heard city officials say that it is highly likely that the site will remain a refinery because refineries that have closed historically reopen again as refineries. They've told us that the level of soil contamination is too high to support any other type of land use beside a refinery or similar heavy industry. City officials have stated to the public multiple times that the city essentially has no power to decide what happens at this site. Those statements are just not true. Other cities faced with the opportunity of what to do with large, highly contaminated tracts of lands in their cities have seized the opportunity to work with all stakeholders, including planners, builders, unions, clean energy companies, and environmental health advocates to create a vision for how best to use the land. The challenge for this advisory group is not to give up on creating a vision for the use of this property, but rather to help determine how these 1,300 contaminated acres that straddle 2 rivers can be developed in a way that would drive economic development, increase recreation by the rivers, and improve the environmental health of the city. Are you up to that challenge? As an environmental health advocate, I beg this subcommittee to use your combined knowledge of industrial pollution to make the city and state leaders understand what is at stake and urge particularly city officials to demonstrate real leadership by meaningfully engaging the broader Philadelphia community in a visioning process that starts with asking residents and stakeholders about what they would like to see the refinery site used for, not how to make a future refinery cleaner or better. With the help of the experts on this environmental subcommittee, we can ensure that the city's final report from this work will include a thorough analysis of alternative uses of the refinery site. We'll ensure that proper remediation of the site is completed with full public engagement, and will encourage opportunities for future uses at the site that do not pollute the air or water, do not harm public health, and do not harm Philadelphia residents' quality of life. The report should include recommendations to the Zoning Planning Commission and the City Council to amend zoning of the refinery area to match the highest and best use of the site identified in the analysis for the report. The residents and the environment in Philadelphia and surrounding areas have paid a heavy price for hosting this refinery. This subcommittee, probably more than any other subcommittee, has the experts that truly understand the devastation caused by having a refinery in a densely populated city. From my perspective as an environmental health leader in Philadelphia, these are my suggestions to the subcommittee. I'm looking to see the end of an old, inefficient, highly polluting plant which has had chronic problems of meeting its environmental obligations. The plant is not economically viable and has survived only thanks to taxpayer support and bankruptcy protection. The plant was a constant danger to first responders, the refinery workforce, nearby neighborhoods, and the region as a whole. Even if the plant were environmentally benign, it does not belong in a densely populated city. Permanently closing the refinery and using land for something non-polluting would be a major improvement to air quality, public health, and quality of life in Philadelphia, and remove the city's single largest industrial contributor of greenhouse gases. The only tragedy in shutting down of this plant is the sudden loss of high-wage union jobs. Whatever the future we envision for this property, we must find a way to create such jobs. We need cleanup. After decades of toxic pollution, it will take a comprehensive and well-informed cleanup effort to make the site usable for future. But this cleanup is very much achievable. However, Sunoco has so far denied local residents, city agencies, local elected officials, workers, and others the opportunity to provide meaningful input on the remediation plans. The Department of Environmental Protection has approved, we believe, Sunoco's weak cleanup standards for much of the refinery property. In addition to Sunoco's remediation of this legacy contamination, PES will now also be responsible for its own cleanup. A new use for this property. The council would like to see this property used for solar energy. We would like to see access of the riverfront property turned into a greenway that can be enjoyed by both nearby residents and Philadelphians. We want future use of the property to ensure the nearby neighborhoods and the city as a whole are protected from air, water, and land pollution. But it is not up to the Clean Air Council to determine the future use of this property. It's up to all stakeholders, including nearby neighbors, planners, builders, workers, unions, clean energy companies, environmental health advocates, and other stakeholders to create a vision for the land use. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. All trends must come to an end. As Mr. Hines begins to speak, I would ask Richard McCant to step up towards the table, please.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is James Hines. I'm an economist. I'm affiliated with the Kleinman Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and I am a professor of economics at the University of Michigan. I am going to talk about the economic consequences of the environmental properties of the refinery, which is the part of the evening you've been most waiting for. As we have heard already, and I am sure we'll hear some more, there are significant costs, health costs and environmental costs, associated with having a highly polluting plant in a dense urban environment, as is the situation in Philadelphia. Some of these costs are reflected in adverse health outcomes. Others are reflected in depressed property values. There's considerable evidence around the country that refineries are associated with depressed local property values. And in addition, there are costs associated with the greenhouse gas emissions for which the plant is responsible. Just a simple calculation using EPA figures yields an annual cost of the greenhouse gas emissions of this refinery when in full operation of roughly $135 million a year. Now, how should one think about these environmental costs weighed against the economic benefits of having a thriving economy? Of course it's important to have a thriving economy. But in the modern era, The cost of having a highly polluting activity is, among other things, that the city will wind up suppressing other economic activities that, in order to achieve a pollution balance that meets the targets that the city sets for itself. If the city goes ahead and continues to have one source of highly polluting activities, then it winds up having a depressing effect on the other economic activities that go on in the same place, and therefore reduces job opportunities elsewhere. One way to think about it is that it's not merely that smart environmental policy is good economics. The evidence of the economic and health costs associated with highly polluting activities in dense environments is compelling. In some, as a result of which, some version of sound environmental policy is sure to be the future for Philadelphia. From the standpoint of the economy, you can think about it that you can do this the hard way or you can do it the easy way. The easy way is to have sound environmental principles that apply to all of the economic activities in the region. The hard way is to have some that are highly polluting and facing the city with the choice of having to address that problem in ways that depress other economic activities. In 2019, in the United States, the trade-off between environmental protection and economic opportunity is illusory. You really can have a healthier city and a healthier economy, but you have to do it the right way. I relinquish the remainder of my time to the next speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. And Mr. McCant, just before you begin, please, I'd ask Mark Zybist to approach the table. Please. Go ahead. You're on. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm on it. I represent Philly Thrive, and we are for justice. And I would just like say this a few words, and not to take up a lot of time. The city has been unable to protect residents from the refinery, pollution, and greed. However, the city does have power to protect our right to breathe. Like all y'all up there like clean air, right? Because it's good for your lungs. It's healthy for you. And it should use that power. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, federal organization, had classified PES as a high priority violator since April 2012. And insufficient non-compliance with Clean Air and Clean Water Act. Pennsylvania Constitution, the state we're in right now, we're in the state of Pennsylvania. Article 1, Section 27 says, the people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, sonic, historic, and how do you pronounce this word? Scenic. Aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. As trustees of these resources, the Commonwealth should conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people. Now, my question to the advisory board: what can you do to help the residents in Philadelphia to clean air, to clean water, and to clean soil? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. McCants. And I'd ask Fritz Steiner, please, to approach the table and turn the mic over to Mr. Sivas.
Good evening,
Wow, now that is under time. Thank you, Mr. McCants.
Good evening. My name is Mark Shebist. I'm an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC. I work on state energy policy for NRDC, and I come to this committee probably as much of an outsider as anybody who's spoken to the committee. I'm not a resident of Philadelphia. I went to law school here at Temple and lived here from 2001 to 2015, or 2001 to 2005. I don't live here now, and so I don't pretend to have knowledge about the effects of this facility. I don't know altogether what questions to ask, and I certainly can't speak to the impacts of the facility on local residents. But I wanted to talk to the committee tonight about the market conditions that this refinery has operated in, and particularly the future of those markets. The main product of this facility has been transportation fuels. I work on climate change issues, and one of my big focuses on the state level is transportation policy. In 2016, transportation overtook the power sector as the largest source of greenhouse gas pollution in the United States. And it's become clear that we need to take strong, urgent action to reduce that kind of pollution. That has implications for the market conditions in which this refinery could operate in the future. Going forward, we need to electrify transportation as much as possible. That's not the only solution for transportation, but it's necessarily a big part of it if we're to make the kinds of reductions in greenhouse emissions that we need to avoid the worst effects of climate change. We also need to improve vehicle efficiency. We need to decarbonize transportation fuels that can't easily be switched to electricity. But all of these factors have major implications for this facility. There are policies that Pennsylvania is starting to invest in right now to take us to a cleaner transportation future. Other states and regions are doing so as well. The effect of those policies will be to reduce demand for the kinds of products that this refinery has produced in the past and potentially could produce in the future. One example of a policy that Pennsylvania has started to look into is the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Governor Wolf signed on to that in the last part of 2018. It's a regional initiative that is seeking ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation in Pennsylvania and throughout the Mid-Atlantic and Northeastern region. To be clear, this transformation in the transportation markets has not played a role in the demise of the plant to date. I think the reasons for the demise were sort of well laid out in the Kleinman's report that was issued earlier this year, or last fall. But they have bearings for what the future use of this plant should be. What we need to do in Pennsylvania and throughout the country is transition as much as we can to a clean energy economy. Again, I can't speak to what uses should be at this facility, but it's clear to me that the city should use whatever influence it can to transform this site into something that serves the clean energy economy rather than impedes it. The last thing I'll say, it's not clear to me exactly what influence this committee and the city has over the future of this facility. But one thing I think that all the stakeholders in the room, from all the different perspectives and whatever disagreements there may be, can probably agree to, is that we probably need a shift in corporate culture to achieve the best and highest use of this facility. For the last 30 or 40 years, the dominant business culture in the United States has been maximizing shareholder value. Last week, the Business Roundtable, which represents 190 or so of the biggest corporations in America, said, we think we should change that. They said we should develop a kind of capitalism that reflects the interests of a broader set of stakeholders, not just shareholders. Whatever the disagreements are here tonight, I think we would all be better served by a kind of corporate culture and interest that is consistent with that kind of overview of our economic system. Thank you very much.
And if Rob Altenberg will please step up to the table. Mr. Steiner.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity for being here. My name is
Fritz, both of you.
Can you hear me? Yeah? No?
No.
Up closer. Oh, okay. Okay, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity for being here. My name is Fritz Steiner. I'm with the Penn Stuart Weitzman School of Design. Philadelphia is not an accident. William Penn and his friends chose this location wisely. They did so by surveying the Delaware River and some of its tributaries without the benefits of maps or computers or anything about the region's geology or hydrology or soils. They went up the river to, their boat was named the Welcome. They went up the river to present-day Trenton, where the fall line was, and they realized that was too far. You couldn't get a ship up there because of all the rapids. So they came back down. They found the site on a higher ground on the west bank. It's easy to reach from the sea, but was also beyond the salt line. So fresh water and access assured, the site offered a bonus as the fall line continues across Philadelphia to the Schuylkill, where the present-day boathouse, around the Boathouse Row. And the falls of the Schuylkill became very important for mills and forges, and eventually gave birth to the Industrial Revolution in North America. So the spot selected by William Penn in 1682 was a very advantageous spot for a city indeed. So now we have a lot of advantages that William Penn did not have. Earlier this evening, it was described as mounds of information. We have maps of geology and hydrology and other physical, biological, and social information. And these maps are all computerized and can be overlaid on each other to display interactions. We can learn from what nature provides and what we can hopefully give back. So what does all this mean for the future of the PES site? I have 3 suggestions. First, a thorough ecological survey of the site and its surroundings should be conducted with GIS technology. Such a survey would be consistent with the state and federal regulatory requirements for cleanup. At a minimum, this survey should include or should map the microclimate, the bedrock and superficial geology, the surface and groundwater, the topography, the soils, historical and current vegetation, historical and current wildlife, contaminated places, transportation, utilities, and historical land use. As the PS site is likely to be flooded as a result of climate change, induced sea level rise, possible changes to the Schuylkill shoreline should be mapped. Similarly, the maps of potential salt line should be noted. Second, there should be an analysis of the opportunities and constraints presented by the site. And third, based on that, options for the future. Many good ideas have already been presented. So the question is, imagine William Penn sailing up the Delaware to the Schuylkill over 300 years after his original visit. Imagine him in a boat called the Welcome, all tricked out with the current technology. And imagine him exploring the floodplain of the Schuylkill, equipped with mounds of information that's now available. What decisions for the future might he make? So the question we have is, might we make equally smart choices as Penn and his colleagues did for citing the city of Philadelphia in the late 17th century with only a fraction of the information we have available today? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Steiner. Thank you. And would Rodney Ray join Rob Altenberg, please, at the table?
Rob. Good evening again. My name is Rob Altenberg. I'm the director of the Energy Center at Citizens for Pennsylvania's Future, or Penn Future. We're a statewide environmental nonprofit with offices in Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Mount Pocono. My message here today is really simple. Subsidizing the petrochemical industry is incompatible with reaching our climate goals. We can't do it. The city and the state have taken some good steps and made some progress towards reaching climate targets, but they haven't done enough. We heard testimony today that the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery produces 20% of the carbon pollution in the city, including cars. That is a huge number. That is not something that we can take and absorb and keep this facility going and have any hope of getting anywhere near our climate goals. We have to get to net zero by 2050. That means addressing cars and addressing the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery. Also, as a lot of people have testified today, we're really running out of time to clean up this facility. As it was just mentioned, the land this facility on is likely to begin flooding in 20 to 50 years and is likely to be completely flooded by 2100. As this land floods, the remediation effort gets even more expensive. We need to address this now. We need to begin the remediation of the facilities now. The pollution from this facility, and we've heard, yes, we've shut down the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery. It's shut down. The pollution should reduce. It isn't necessarily going to reduce. We're going to reduce certainly that carbon pollution we're going to reduce. We're going to reduce air toxics. The Philadelphia Energy Solutions refineries already registered emissions reduction credits that they're going to sell to other facilities, and other facilities are going to come into the region and use those credits to continue polluting. We need a plan to reduce pollution, not to subsidize petrochemical plants and keep them running, not to get a few more years out of this refinery. We've got to reverse that now. And the way we need to reverse it is we need to focus on clean energy jobs, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. A number of people have testified about this already today. Now, we worked, and many other people in this room have worked on a project with the state, Finding Pennsylvania's Solar Future, where we looked at what it would take to get to 10% solar in the state. That's actually a modest target for what the state can do. There were 300 stakeholders that came together to work on these plans, and they addressed a number of key issues. Now, these are the same issues that when we're looking at what do you do next for the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery, what do you have to look at? Well, to get clean energy businesses in this refinery, aside from the remediation issue that we have to take care of, we've got to take care of access to capital. We've got to make sure that these companies can go through. That means entering into long-term contracts with clean energy businesses. That means potentially setting up a green bank so that clean energy businesses can get financing in this area. We need to work on this. Now, that's just one step forward, and I won't go into the whole 52 action items that we came up with in this plan, but the fact that our group put together 300 stakeholders to look at enhancing clean and renewable energy, it should be relatively easy for the city to get an equivalent group to focus on solutions specifically for the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery, and we hope we do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Altenberg. And as Mr. Ray prepares to speak, I'd ask Sheila Tripathi to please take her seat at the table.
Hello. My name's Rodney Ray. I worked at Refinery. I was a union laborer for 30 years. I worked during shutdowns at the Atlantic Refinery. We used to get inside the tanks, put scaffolding around the inside of the tanks and chip the oil off and go down and bag it up and bring it back out. I did 7/12s for 4 years straight. And what I'm saying, it all hit me 4 years ago when I couldn't breathe. It takes me a while to get up the steps. I have to stop now in the middle of the steps to get up. I was landed in the hospital for 35 days. I had to sleep with 3 pillows. If I take one pillow out, it felt like I was drowning. And I'm just here to say that the refinery needs to be shut down. Simple as that. It's dangerous work. It's dangerous for the community. It's explosions happening. It's time to shut it down. Today I came here to talk about jobs for my community, but then I was sitting over there. I said, I don't want nobody to go through what I'm going through now. So I'm not going to talk about jobs for my community. But what I would talk about is the concept of a green energy hub deserves consideration if about 1/5 of the refinery land could be used for a factory for wind turbines similar to a factory in Fort Madison, Iowa. It would provide 650 manufacturing jobs for our region. So I'm just here to say today, I'm not going to be up here long. It needs to stay shut down.
Thank you, Mr. Ray. Thank you. And will Walter Sue please come up to the table, and Mr. Pathy.
Hi, I'm Sheila Chapathy, and I'm an air pollution exposure scientist at Drexel University. There are two key points I would like to focus on today. First is the impact of air pollution from the refinery on resident exposures, and the second includes ideas for the city to develop a more comprehensive air monitoring network in South Philadelphia. We know the refinery was the largest point source for air pollution in Philadelphia before the fire in June. During last week's labor meeting, it was said that there are other sources of air pollution near the refinery, including the airport. This is true. There are multiple sources of air pollution close to each other in South Philadelphia, including the airports, ports, highways, and the refinery. Because the refinery isn't the only source of air pollution in the area, the cumulative burden of air pollution exposures to residents is actually even greater when considering the refinery in addition to these other sources. City officials need to take this into account when assessing the impact of the refinery on exposures to residents and when considering future plans for the site. I've heard from community members that when discussing health impacts of the refinery with city council members, they have been asked for proof. The burden to prove the refinery's impact on health effects should not be placed on the residents. Related to this point, I would also like to talk about how Philadelphia Air Management Services can better serve residents living near the refinery, regardless of what happens to the site in the future. Currently, there are only 2 government regulatory monitoring sites in South Philadelphia with data that can be readily downloaded from the EPA AQS website. However, the monitor located at Rittner and 24th Street is not adequately positioned to assess community air pollution exposures from the refinery because of its location and proximity to traffic-related sources. During the June fire, this monitor was also not in the appropriate location to monitor air pollution from the fire based on the wind direction at that time. This is the monitor that we saw earlier in the day measured as referred to as RIT. I believe that there is a great opportunity here to develop an improved air monitoring network in South Philadelphia. While air monitoring is also performed directly on the PES refinery site, AMS should ideally place additional fixed monitors in surrounding communities both upwind and downwind from the refinery. Strategically placing monitors in these locations will improve the ability to assess ambient air pollution and impacts from multiple pollutant sources. AMS could also develop a comprehensive monitoring program based on examples from refinery locations around the United States. For example, California Air Resources Board uses a layered monitoring strategy in locations near refineries, which includes fence line monitoring as well as a combination of fixed, portable, and mobile monitors in nearby communities. If a similar network were implemented in South Philadelphia, it would also be able to monitor the impacts of a fire, such as the one that happened this June, over a much larger area. I'm glad to see that the city is starting to use the Harvard impactors we saw earlier. I believe these monitors were originally developed for the New York Community Air Survey in New York City. I've used the same monitors in Pittsburgh and also in Auckland, New Zealand. I think this is a great start. I do want to add that these are typically integrated samples of PM 2.5, so that's an average over the period of 1 week or 2 weeks. It would also be great to have other pollutants such as benzene or other VOCs that were mentioned, as well as real-time or continuous monitors, so that we're able to look at air pollution data at a much finer temporal scale than what's being used with those monitors. I believe those monitors also use passive sampling for ozone, NO2, and NO2. We need an improved air monitoring plan to ensure the safety of residents and provide the necessary data to develop fine-scale health effect studies. Data from monitoring locations should also be more transparent, easily accessible, and presented in user-friendly formats. Currently, data from the monitoring sites within PES are available online in PDF format. If readily accessible to the public, this data, along with data collected by AMS, could be used in both retrospective and prospective health effect studies. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Let me ask Nadine Grun, please, to step up to the table and the microphone to
Hi,
Mr.
I'm
Sue.
Dr. Walter Tsu. I'm the Executive Director for Physicians for Social Responsibility here in Philadelphia. Perhaps no single issue is more pressing for Philadelphia than finding new jobs for laid-off workers at Hahnemann and PES Refinery. Since these hearings are about PES, I will limit my comments to this group. Fundamental to PES's future is what the city agrees to use for its land and its remediation. As has been noted by many, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It will have an impact for many future generations of Philadelphians. Although there are no surveys, I believe, and based on the audience reaction in this room, I believe Philadelphia wants this land for non-polluting, non-fossil fuel purposes that can be either valued for its commercial or industrial use. Given what we know about climate change, it would be highly irresponsible for the land to be used to process fossil fuels again. Its location near the airport and the Delaware River makes it an ideal location for shipping, transportation hub, or for that next Amazon. The problem with the location is the ground pollution, which we heard from David Brown, and here's my comment about that. If, in fact, this is private land, we cannot simply say that it can be used forever and they can pollute whatever they want on that land. We have to start thinking that, as the Iroquois have said, that we have to think of 7 generations in the future. The 7th generation of Philadelphians on that land will not remember that there was an oil refinery at that location. And we have a responsibility, frankly, to remediate it to the finest residential quality as possible. The fact that you can actually take a baseball field and the surrounding area can be remediated to residential quality suggests to me that you need to do that for the entire property, because 7 generations from now, people are going to be walking on that land and want to know why they're getting sick. For the current workforce, there's no one better able to disassemble the enormous refinery infrastructure than the current PES employees. The owners of this land need to hire the current workers to begin this work instead of laying them off. In addition, the city should hold PES, Evergreen, and PES responsible for the remediation work that needs to happen, but it cannot happen unless they disassemble the current refinery. During this assembly process, we need to rethink out of the box about how we can simultaneously electrify our buildings and our residences. The combination of geothermal, electric boilers, heat pumps, and cooling units need to be installed into the residences across the city. All of this requires a rethinking of the shared resources like community geothermal or community solar, which can be used to rebuild our neighborhoods. We believe there are literally hundreds of jobs that need to occur that can hire these workers to build the geothermal wells, install the boilers and heat pumps. We could create an air conditioning loan program for the elderly on these enormously hot days, and the PES workers can help install these units during April to August and remove them when the temperatures go down. People can donate their air conditioner units who upgrade to central air conditioning and get a tax deduction. The funding of these projects ideally comes from government, foundations, and individuals, but ideally we need to agree to pass something like a carbon tax or something in the future to fund the infrastructure changes we need in America. Once electrified, it's much easier to talk about what is the source of the electricity, but clearly, in the future, renewable sources is going to be the most economical way of providing energy and electricity. Finally, I would be remiss in not mentioning, as a physician, not to mention the enormous side benefit of moving toward renewables, as many people have pointed out here. Non-polluting sources literally will save hundreds of lives and avoid numerous potential tragedies, like the hydrogen fluoride release that would have made Philadelphia the next Bhopal. Air pollution and ground-level ozone are potent risk factors for premature death, and locating a pollution source in the middle of this city has always been a public health disaster. This is a total win-win. Cheaper energy, no pollution, safer jobs for workers, and healthier lives for America. We need to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Soom. Ms. Grun to begin her remarks.
All right, good evening. Can everyone hear me?
No.
No. Now can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. My name is Nadine Gruen. I have a PhD in chemistry. I am the managing director of the Vagelos Institute for Energy Science and Technology at the University of Pennsylvania. The research in our institute aims at meeting the world's present and future energy needs in a sustainable way. As we've discussed from so many people tonight, gasoline and other liquid fuels are the major products that are made from oil during the refining process. But refining is also the source of the chemicals that are used to make a large range of consumer goods we all rely on. Today, petrochemicals account for about 6% of the outputs of refineries, but they account for nearly 90% of the feedstocks used by the chemical industry. These critical carbon-based building blocks have been available in sufficient supply and at low cost due to the economy of scale of this enormous refining industry. Virtually all of the material goods that we use are made from these chemicals. Plastics, yes, but also medicines, fibers used for making clothing, textiles and carpets, paints, glues, pesticides, fertilizers, detergents, body care products, the ink that will print the many reports that will come from this esteemed group, and on and on. While chemistry and other sciences have made enormous advances in the past 100 years, oil refineries have continued to operate in almost the same way since the early 20th century. With the rapid rise of renewable energy, and there's no doubt renewable energy is on the way, it's here, traditional refineries face a continued uphill battle to remain open. Companies around the world are already moving to retrofit refineries to convert a larger fraction of crude oil to chemicals rather than gasoline. This is a challenging endeavor from an economic standpoint. It is not clear that profit margins based on high demand for gasoline will be sustainable in the future. The one certainty is that the demand for products made from chemicals will continue long after our energy sector has completely transitioned away from using oil. We are at a critical moment to plan proactively for the inevitable separation of the chemical and energy sectors. Their transition from oil as the source of carbon-based chemicals presents a tremendous business opportunity. The incredible expertise, training, and work ethic of the existing refinery workforce is a valuable asset for enticing companies involved in new, clean ways of producing all of these goods that we use. The written statement that we submitted detailed a few of the exciting examples of new technologies for producing goods that do not rely on oil. One I want to mention here is the reduction of carbon dioxide, or CO2, to make methanol. Methanol is one of the building blocks of the chemical industry, with over 110 million metric tons produced per year. Currently, all of this methanol is made from oil or natural gas. However, a plant has been open in Iceland since 2011 that produces methanol from only CO2 and water. Iceland's access to abundant geothermal energy provided a competitive advantage to implement this process. However, as the energy sector moves to renewables, this technology is beginning to be cost competitive worldwide. In conclusion, as the energy sector continues the transition to renewables, enticing industry to Philadelphia that will contribute to the transition from oil as a source of carbon-based chemicals is a tremendous opportunity for the long term. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask Bethany Wiggin to step up to the table, please, and Ms. Hemingway to begin her remarks.
Good evening, everyone. I am glad to be able to be at this table to talk about this issue. My name is Carol Hemingway, and I am a social justice advocate and health advocate, and a proud member of Philly Thrive. One of the things that I want to say about this whole issue, I get it. I get it that there are many stakeholders involved in this whole situation, that everybody has an invested interest. I also get this, that the city of Philadelphia needs to be a front runner in this whole issue of making our environment a clean environment, looking for new ways to do innovative things. And I think that that's what we hold. I think that the fact that, and I have these Shame on You awards. And my shame on you is the shame is on EPA, shame is on DPA, or any other AP. The shame is on this city officials that allowed this oil refinery to continue working and performing as it did for 105 years. The refinery is a civil rights issue. As people most marginalized and oppressed in our society bear the brunt of pollution. This includes people of color, poor people, children, women, and seniors. People of color, of the 45,000 residents living within 1 mile of that refinery, 71% are people of color, and 32% are below the poverty line. A 2017 report by the NAACP highlighted the PES refinery as part of the nationwide trend of fossil fuel operations disproportionately impacting African American communities. The report cited PES as being responsible for 72% of the toxic air emission in Philadelphia. Poor people and women. There's an enormous amount of unpaid labor and economic sacrifices in our community due to being sick and or for caring for sicker family members. This includes missing work, not being able to work, missing school, and emotional distress that gets in the way of work. This also can be seen as a woman's rights issue, as women are often relied on as the caretakers. PEH has located low-income housing very near the refinery, including the developments Wilson Park, Bartram Village, Tasker Homes, which is now referred to as the Greater Grace Ferry Estates, and the former Pashiak Homes, which was demolished due to oil underneath the homes. These low-income Philadelphians have had no choice but live right next to the pollution, breathing, and it being at risk daily. Children and seniors. Children are severely impacted as childhood asthma rate in Philadelphia is 22% compared to 7% nationally. Poor children are even more impacted, as the asthma rate is 25% of the poorest neighborhoods in Philadelphia. In 2019, a 2019 report, the Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America ranked Philadelphia 4th for the asthma capitals of the country. Philly was the only city on the list of 100 to rank worse than average for all 3 categories: asthma prevalence, death rate for asthma, and ER visits for asthma. There are many schools within 1 mile of that refinery, including Acorn Elementary School, Acorn Middle School Academy, Orton Reed High School, University Vare Charter School, St. Gabriel Elementary School, McDaniel School, and the high school we are currently in. And then, of course, there's all the daycare and nursery centers. These kids have no choice but to breathe the pollution in close proximity to PES. There are countless senior apartment buildings within 1 mile of the refinery, including Greater Great Ferry Estates AWS Senior Housing, St. John, Newman, Wilson Park Senior Apartment, and more. It would have been a nightmare trying to evaluate seniors during the 2021 explosion, and the health of the seniors is at risk every day breathing pollution. Conclusion, it is unconstitutional for any further development of the refinery to negatively harm these groups of people. This means polluting industry is not an option. These groups of people need to be at the center of decision-making and need to benefit concretely from the development of jobs, welfare creating staying in the neighborhoods, improving air quality. Community-owned renewable energy projects could check all of these bases. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hemingway. Thank you. I'd like to ask Dan Shupsky, please, to step up to the table, and Ms. Wiggins to make her remarks.
Thank you, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to present these remarks. I'm Dr. Bethany Wiggin. I'm a professor in the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania and the faculty director of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities. I'll make 3 points this evening. I'm supplying the committee with longer written remarks that include our public research materials about the tidal Schuylkill River that runs through the refinery lands. These materials include oral histories collected in Eastwick and a variety of historic documents curated, as well as curated virtual tours and exhibits of the tidal Schuylkill River and environs. Spoiler alert, here are my 3 points. Long ago, when William Penn was negotiating with the Lenni Lenape, South Philadelphia, including Southwest Philadelphia, was very soggy. That's why he went to Penn's Landing. Since then, we've dried these wetlands out, but point 2, it's getting wetter again. Our planet's climate is changing at an accelerating pace, and regardless which future climate scenario we assume, by the year 2100, and likely well before then, climate models unequivocally show that refinery lands will again be very wet indeed. And point 3, the water is returning to dried land where it will mix with what we've released onto it for a very long time. As we've heard, this refinery has a long history, in operation for 100 years before the passage of the Clean Air and Water Acts. Today, we must consider the legacy pollutants the water is mixing with as it's returning. We must avert creating a still more toxic stew. Let me share just a little of the research I've been guiding on the tidal river and about what we know about its environmental history. It's actually not a lot, and while that means my remarks can be short, that's actually something that should worry us. There is, for example, no pollutant load data for the tidal river, although thousands of Philadelphians are today eager to boat on it. With colleagues at Drexel and ANS, we've been taking air and water quality measurements, but we don't have reliable longitudinal studies. And, as we've already heard multiple times today, we really must collect better data. In oral histories collected with the Eastwick Friends and Neighbors Coalition, with support from the John Hines National Wildlife Refuge, we're also learning about how hard it is to know what to do when water comes. In Margie Cobb's oral history of living with water in Eastwick, for example, she explains how difficult it was to know what to do when storms surged unexpectedly, how she faced great uncertainty about where to take her elderly mother. You can imagine how hard it is to figure out what to do while you're listening to the contents of your basement crashing together on waves of water. We also learned about the rich environment that we've sacrificed to build this refinery beginning in the 1860s. We've uncovered all kinds of paintings and drawings of all kinds of people enjoying the river until into the late 19th century. Old maps show wetlands stretching over more than 6,000 acres. About 200 remain today. These are the Hines Refuge. These historic losses continue to compound today. Without the buffer zones that coastal wetlands provide, we have opened ourselves up to greater storm surge. water poses a rising threat to South and Southwest Philadelphia along 3 lines, with these higher storm surges and more severe storms, with sea level rise, and with more extreme rain events, which bring more rain in short time, overwhelming a system not built for so much water. Unfortunately, climate change compounds the vulnerability of the fence line environmental justice communities of South and Southwest Philadelphia, adding ongoing insult to historic injury. And even with global reductions in carbon dioxide emissions, by 2100, the PES refinery lands will be very wet indeed. The water will come back to where the old maps had it. But it will come back and mix with who knows what hazards, because we still don't have sufficient data for the pollutants on the land or in and under the water. In closing, let me emphasize that I am not pointing fingers. As a society, we owe much to cheap oil, and I myself have greatly benefited from the low cost of carbon. But in our era of accelerating climate change, the additional costs have become too high for us all. We cannot keep the water away, and it's mixing with petroleum and other substances used in the refining process. We cannot afford to remain blissfully ignorant of all that's mixed up along the tidal river. Let's not look away from the people and the places it will soak.
Thank you, Ms. Wiggin. Let me ask Lisa Hastings to come up to the table, and Mr. Shupsky, in your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. What a wonderful array of speakers, right? How brave, how courageous, right? It's really important to note before I ask questions, and I have a lot of questions, that the fossil fuel industry is the most heavily subsidized industry in this country. It's more subsidized than our education system. The cost of gasoline and the cost of producing fossil fuels are subsidized such that they are cheaper than they should be. It's really important to understand this. It's really important that the public understands this, and it's important to note that the externalities, the costs associated with producing fossil fuels, the negative costs, the negative externalities with regard to pollution and human health effects are vast, and they are not baked into the cost of gasoline at the pump. It's underscoring everything here. Oil and gas industry has no one's interest but their own at heart. They are a single bottom line organization that cares only about their shareholders' profits, period. That's who we are up against, those of us who are speaking. In light of that, my usual question applies. How much weight does this advisory council have? And how much weight will this report carry to the decision maker? And who is the ultimate decision maker? Does the public, beyond these meetings, have an actual say in the decision that is going to affect their lives? That question has still not been answered, just for the record. As the city's environmental lawyer explained pessimistically, but within reason, there is not much power that the city can wield due to PES being private property. My question also remains, when the land is resold or turned over, can the city rezone this site to put more proactive environmental policy changes in place, such as the creation of a sustainability master plan for the new owner, a flooding resiliency plan, an Act 2 timeline with consequences, or even rezone the land to allow less of an industrial presence? You have spoken a lot about what the city cannot do, but you have not spoken a lot about what the city can do. Has this site's designation as a Keystone Opportunity Zone allowed it to circumvent any standard procedures with regard to it being labeled either a brownfield or Superfund site? Specifically, is PES designated a special industrial area? And if so, has this affected its ability to be remediated? Referencing Penn's Beyond Bankruptcy report, the following questions arise. The city has known Sunoco has not conformed to their Act 2 requirements since 2006 regarding public involvement. So why has 13 years gone by without rectifying this? If Sunoco has not conformed to their Act 2 requirements, can the city ask the DEP to declare a reopener on their agreement? Again, per this report, it references a U.S. EPA open comment period occurring in 2020 on the proposed site cleanup. When is this scheduled to occur in 2020, and how will this be advertised to the public? Does this advisory panel think it wise to render an official verdict on the future of this site prior to the EPA's scheduled 2020 open public comment period? According to the DEP, land banks, which are public entities, local municipalities, or public bodies, may acquire properties that require remediation as part of a redevelopment effort per the land bank or the land recycling program as it relates to Act 2. One suggestion could be that once PES vacates the land, and as long as the land remains vacant, that the City of Philadelphia create a land bank specifically designated to purchase and remediate this property per the Land Bank Act. Would something like this be possible? And then a suggestion. In my opinion, this area would be best suited as an innovative testing ground where an industrial ecology park was created as a model for learning how to decommission oil and gas refineries. In this regard, leading experts in the oil and gas industry, as well as union labor, would use to create standard operating procedures on the dismantling of plants like these. Scientists would continuously monitor the site, and environmental remediation experts could set up shop and experiment on different techniques to remediate the land. During this time, industry, government, and academia, all of which we have in Philadelphia, would learn how to take the oldest, least efficient, and least modern plants offline, and environmentalists would learn how to best work with industry, train the next generation, and how to design a symbiotic processes and policies to retire and rehabilitate places like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shutsky. If Mark Clincy, could come up to the table, and then Ms. Hastings begin her remarks.
Hi, good evening. I don't know if I can follow that one. I loved it. I think that it is critical. Yes?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
please.
Yes, my name is Lisa Hastings. I live and breathe in Philadelphia, and environmental quality and science are my life's passions and my former profession. At this point, I feel it's critical for Philadelphia to move past its codependent relationship with fossil fuels and provide its residents with a healthier environment and a better future. The city can make a lot of progress in meeting its legal, constitutional, moral, and scientific obligations to the environment and to its residents by just closing the refinery and leaving it closed forever. They can even do more by remediating and restoring the site to many non-fossil fuel uses in the future. First, no oil refinery, other fossil fuel, or other dirty energy project should be allowed at this site. The city's environment and its residents, especially but not completely those who live in South Philadelphia, have suffered enough. It's not the only source, but everybody's told you already how large it is. There are other reasons, specifically not to reopen an oil refinery, even if the city powers want to do it. The refinery has long been a serious polluter, emitting over 70% of all the toxic emissions. Interestingly, the neighborhood around it has the worst toxic air contamination in the city, and recent EPA ambient toxic assessment gave it a rating of having 40 extra cancer deaths every year. It exceeds air quality emission standards frequently, and all AMS does is fine it and let it keep operating instead of shutting it down. In the last few years, the refinery has been reported to have violated not only the Clean Air Act, but the Clean Water Act and RCRA. It's obvious it contributes to worsening climate change. Is this really something the city wants to perpetuate? And there's no reason to believe that if there was a new owner, that suddenly the pollution would lessen and everything, we could go along just fine. Some of the best proof of that were the very compelling testimonies of all the skilled workers last week who explained how diligently they maintained the refinery. And I think basically remediation is tricky, but it needs to be done. And it needs to be done with the community so that things are, people are not unnecessarily harmed. After remediation is under the way, it'll be easier to analyze exactly what we could do, although it'll probably need more remediation and probably won't for many, many years. You want to have people on it, but it could be an elevated solar farm with bioremediation continuing underneath it. Perhaps some of it could be planted as a dense urban forest. It would help reduce flooding, improve air quality, reduce the summer heat in the neighborhood, which would be important, reduce carbon from other nearby sources, and help beautify the area. How hard would that be? It would be an inexpensive, at least temporary solution. The area closest to the river, once it's clean enough, could be planted with appropriate grasses and left otherwise undeveloped, allowing the ebb and flow of the river and the predicted rising water levels to occur without causing serious monetary damage, while restoring some of the natural habitat on that side of the river. Finally, well, the city is still claiming it has almost no power because, it's a private ownership. If they put as much energy into finally looking for a private owner who would be willing to ask for a zoning change, they could do that. Possibly there could be a zoning overlay that would just simply be, this could still be industrial, but it needs to be a no fossil fuel climate mitigation overlay. If nothing else is possible, could they condemn it? And they could definitely take the property for the public purposes, the environmental, the medical, and also the city would benefit from unlimited economic and social benefit of being much more attractive to new investment, visitors, and residents by taking bold action to break our city's addiction to dirty fossil fuel and take real action on climate change. We could brag about that.
Thank you, Ms. Hastings. Mr. Clancy, do you need some assistance coming up to the table? Yep. And if Rob Guski could please come up in the meantime. Thank you, Mr. Clancy. You can begin whenever you're ready.
Good evening. Everybody hear me? Good evening.
Yes, sir.
My name is Mark Clancy, proud member of Philly Thrive, and we are advocating for the right to breathe clean air in the city of Philadelphia. I have 3 points I'd like to make, and I'll be brief. First, the refinery's pollution has been harming our health. The PES refinery has been the single largest source of local air pollution in the city, accounting for more than 50% of individual toxic chemicals that harm human health. There have been over 70,000 scientific studies that show how air pollution likely impacts every single organ in the body, leading to asthma, many forms of cancer, heart attacks, strokes, dementia, diabetes, miscarriage, infant health problems, and more. The World Health Organization has declared air pollution a public health emergency. Phillies Drive's own research in the community has shown that asthma prevalence rate is approximately 4 times the national average in South Philadelphia, 33.9%. Having a refinery in our neighborhoods is dangerous and unsafe. The city first reported that no hydrofluoric acid was released during the June 21st explosions at PES, and air quality was safe. Then why were residents going to the hospital on that same day? Now the city is awaiting a report from PES about some amount of hydrofluoric acid that was released. Thankfully, a whole lot wasn't released. More than 400,000 Philadelphians live in the blast zone of oil trains carrying oil to the refinery. Blast zones are the half-mile radius of everything that could be incinerated if an oil train were to derail and explode. There have been 2 oil train derailments in Philadelphia in the last 5 years. I got you. Sustainable development that holds corporations accountable and benefits the community is the only way forward. It is crucial that local, state, and federal officials ensure that past and current owners of the refinery pay for the full cleanup. It cannot and should not be shouldered by the taxpayers who didn't create the mess in the first place. At least $200,000 should be granted by the city and state for residents to oversee a land use study, to interview consultants on proposals for land use and development. Planting an urban forest on the land would mitigate air pollution that will still exist in the neighborhood, reduce climate change impacts, clean up the soil, and create a cooling effect in our neighborhoods. Many residents have expressed interest in a community-owned renewable energy source being built on the refinery site. If the entire site were used to produce electricity using solar panels, it would generate enough power for 45,000 homes. Every house in Grays Ferry and Point Breeze, plus several thousand more. Finally, City Council must pass a moratorium on fossil fuels to protect residents from worsening health and an unlivable planet. Our lives are at stake. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Clancy. Perfect timing. I'd ask Maggie Gamer, please, to approach, and Mr. Guskey to begin.
Good evening. My name is Rob Guskey. I'm a Philadelphia resident and degreed petroleum engineer with 35 years of industry experience. To gain valuable perspective, it's important to review recent refinery history. Due to poor financial results, Sunoco planned to shut the refinery in 2012. However, private equity firm Carlyle Group and Energy Transfer Partners rescued the site from financial distress in a deal that was supported by tax breaks and grants that saved thousands of jobs. Currently, finding a buyer for the PES refinery has grown urgent as the bankrupt company's funds dwindle and no signs emerge that it is winning a fight for insurance payouts after the June 21st blaze. Based on the financial results for the last two refinery owners, Sunoco and PES, and the inevitable global transition to a carbon-neutral economy, the grim reality is the site likely has no future as an oil refinery. We need to take a hard look at the current remediation plans and future potential uses for the site to ensure they are compatible. Sunoco chose to pursue site-specific, non-residential standards for remediation of the Philadelphia refinery complex on the assumption that the property remains industrial. Evergreen, on behalf of Sunoco, is currently preparing a final report and cleanup plan for the facility. At recent advisory group meetings, refinery employees implored on behalf of some 36,000 affected workers in our area to keep the refinery open to provide for their families. Local residents pleaded for clean air and water for the health of their families and 1.6 million Philadelphians. A preliminary decision analysis was performed, which resulted in few site options being identified that met key stakeholders' success criteria. However, one option that stood out was Brightfield Solar, which is a demonstrated solution for brownfield industrial sites. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, a Brightfield is an abandoned or contaminated property that is redeveloped through the incorporation of solar energy. Experienced companies offer solar power purchase agreements where they assume the risk by obtaining financing, permits, and installing and operating the solar facility in exchange for a long-term contract to purchase the electricity. Local governments and property owners win by returning unusable land to productive use while generating income and tax revenue. Utilities and solar developers win by building profitable solar generation close to areas of high electric demand. Residents and workers win through reduced emissions and expanded access to local high-tech jobs. I urge you, as our representatives serving on the Environment Committee of the Refinery Advisory Group, to recommend that investigation of Brightfield Solar be included in the city's final report.
Thank you, Mr. Jeske. I'd like to ask Pamela Grant to step up to the table, please, and Ms. Gamera.
Great. Hi, my name is Maggie. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in South Philly. I currently live in West Philadelphia. I am a part of Philly Thrive, and I'm also speaking as an individual citizen. The way these public meetings have been divided up into segments that posit that the environment might be a separate area of expertise that is somehow less involved in labor or less involved in community or less involved in business is a gigantic problem and leads to a lot of misunderstandings, I think, about the emergency state that the world is in right now. I want to sort of address my remarks actually to the whole public advisory group and not just to the environmental group, because really when we think about the word environment and what environmental care might be, it's not a matter of scientific expertise, it's a moral issue. And that is borne by each of us in this room, and especially by all of the people on the panel, not just the environmental committee. So even though this is a multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder group decision-making process that I'm sure is really frustrating, I've been a part of those sorts of, professional committees that, do some work and talk a lot and do a lot of listening. And I understand that this group was not given power to make a decision, but you do, as a group, have the ability to hold power and build power and take power together. And even in the diversity of your expertise and your different interests and your different perspectives and your different stakes and the different people that you're representing, I would be really shocked if there was a single person on this panel tonight that didn't have some inkling of understanding, maybe deep within their hearts or their brains, that this really is a global disaster that we're in right now, and that bold, brave action really is extremely necessary, not actually just for 7 generations out, but for our own lives here in this room. So I really commend whoever it was that spoke at the beginning that encouraged, really brave and difficult listening. And I encourage you all to act unanimously as a group and hold each other accountable to recognizing that any discussion that considers fossil fuel industry as any kind of possibility for the future of this site is a waste of time and is doing harm to everybody in this room, including yourselves.
Thank you, Ms. Guerrero. If Sarah Davidson would come up to the table, please, and Ms. Grant, begin your remarks when you're ready.
Hi, my name is Pamela Grant. I'm a Philly Thrive volunteer. I'm from Philadelphia, born and raised. And when I woke up in the middle of the day to see a smoke bomb the size of Hiroshima, I couldn't believe what I saw. I thought it was 9/11 all over again. And seriously, that just put me in a state of trauma. I hear everybody coming up here today, and we're speaking about all of these actual factual methods that can happen in transfer of this oil refinery. Now, I don't want to sit here and have this be a deal of what they don't know won't hurt them. I didn't know that the oil refinery was poison. I didn't know that it was pouring out gases that is polluting the air, causing asthma, birth defects, abortions, miscarriages. Like, seriously, I already have to walk in the hood and have to choose between what poisonous food I'm going to put in my mouth today or tomorrow. So why do I really have to sit here and tell and explain to my baby that she's going to die slow because a private refinery doesn't want to move or doesn't want to stop? That doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand why we are having these conversations. Like the young lady with me, there is power in this room that can make this refinery go and not come back. It's poison, period. I can't even believe we're having this discussion. Y'all can find the money. Go find it overseas. I'm sure y'all got friends that can find the money to figure out if it's a matter of taking the workers that have already been in a refinery, because nobody wants no one to lose a job. But these workers are slaves to a business of a company that is poisoning them. And then I'm sitting here having to go every day and ignore it. That doesn't make any sense to me. When there's enough money, go print it. I don't know, go find the people to go print it. Find it, give it to them so they can maybe take that area. Mushrooms, put the mushrooms in the ground. Let the mushrooms come up and get the soil right. It's bad, it's toxic, it's nothing you can do with that. But we can take over the time, plant trees, get these workers back to work. They don't want to be out of work. Okay, they can plant the trees, put the grass. I would love to have a beautiful community of trees. There's already a lack of trees in Philadelphia anyway. So let's get that system, that ecosystem going. I do not understand why we are having these conversations. I do not understand why people are being paid right now to sit up here and talk about something that it shouldn't even be a conversation. I don't get it. So, with that being said, we have the knowledge, the power, the people to put the wind power, the solar energy, whatever you got to do. But it's enough power, it's enough people to do so. And I'm not about to sit up here and keep telling my baby and baby's babies that we're going to sit here in a genocide and die slow because somebody doesn't want to do any work. So.
Thank you, Ms. Grant. Is Sarah Davidson? Sarah Davidson and Sherry Cohen. Ms. Sherry Cohen can come up to the table and speak next. Is Sherry Cohen here as well? Oh, okay, so you're just ready to go. Okay, please.
Hi, I want to thank, can everybody hear me? I can hear myself now on the mic. Okay. I want to thank the advisory group for giving us an opportunity to speak, and thank you to everybody who's hung out this long and to all the other speakers. This has been really impressive. My name is Sarah Davidson. I'm an earth scientist, and I live in Graduate Hospital. I'm here today as a resident and to represent the Philly Pod of 500 Women Scientists, which is a grassroots volunteer organization with the mission to serve society by making science open, inclusive, and accessible. As you evaluate options for the future of the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery site, we urge this advisory group to see its role as part of a larger conversation about the energy and economic transition the city must undertake to address climate change. It should integrate the city's plans to reduce emissions and Mayor Kenny's commitment to the Paris Agreement, which requires that the city be at zero net emissions by roughly 2015 or sooner. So that's less than 30 years, basically. The city's 2018 Clean Energy Vision recognizes the critical role of the PES refinery site in getting to zero emissions. The report states that, quote, the city, residents, and other stakeholders will need to work together to determine the future of the South Philadelphia oil refinery currently operated by Philadelphia Energy Solutions. The refinery is the single largest source of particulate emissions in the city and alone accounts for nearly 16% of Philadelphia's carbon footprint, not including the fossil fuel products exported off-site, end quote. This advisory group is now potentially starting the conversation envisioned in the city's report. We have the following recommendations. First, as implied above, use this as an opportunity to plan for the transition of the PES site to one not dependent on fossil fuels. Second, financial assessments should consider the impact of various climate policies on the city and potential buyers of the site, including carbon pricing bills that have been introduced in Congress or other potential future regulations. Third, consult with the schools and programs that are training our local workforce and coordinate so that they're providing residents with the skills that will be needed to support the future long-term use of this site. Fourth, consult with scientists to understand the climate and health impacts of alternative options for use of the site. 500 Women Scientists represents over 20,000 women scientists globally, and the Philly Pod has 170 members. We would be happy to support the advisory group's work by connecting you with relevant experts and information or requesting input from our membership. My 4-year-old son will be 86 in the year 2100, which is the year that many climate projections end. He and his generation are depending on us to start this transition. Voting and public polling records indicate that the vast majority of Philadelphia families support reducing emissions and the development of jobs and infrastructure that don't rely on fossil fuels. We thank the advisory group for their important work to sustain the city's communities and economy now and into the future. And I think, like many people have said, we're not totally clear on what power you guys have, what leverage you have, and you might not be sure yourselves. But as a few other people have also mentioned, I urge you to see what you can do with some imagination and some courage, and if maybe you can pull out some more power from this than maybe you think you have. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davidson. Sherry Cohen, and then we will look at the sign-up sheet between now and 8:30.
Hello, my name is Sherry Cohen, and I'm an independent candidate for City Council at large, running to replace a Republican on City Council on November the 5th. I am pro-environment, I am pro-community, and I am pro-union. I have been thinking about the following issue. Why do refinery workers and the community appear to be at odds with one another on the issue of the future of the refinery? Isn't this just what all the refinery owners over time would want? Isn't it the corporate owners who are responsible for the immediate letting go of the workers, the contamination of land and water, and damage to the health and lives of the community? It is these entities that must be our targets, not one another. Do we agree that the corporate owners must pay to clean up the land and water they polluted? That the corporate owners must invest big time in the health of people in the community? That they must fund full wages and benefits for the now unemployed workers for a good number of years with retraining and pensions with health care for those ready to retire? As the Arctic and the Amazon burn, do we agree that fossil fuels are the fuels of the past, not the future? As we look around the world, throughout this nation and this city, do we agree that historically marginalized communities are the first and worst impacted by climate pollution? Then can these be our first points of unity? And what can our city representatives do in these meetings and afterwards to help us forge a stronger unity? Let's look to other parts of our nation where labor and community have been joining together. In March, the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor approved a resolution in support of a Green New Deal to address climate change and economic inequality. In April, Maine's AFL-CIO, which includes 160 labor unions, became the first state federation to support a Green New Deal. In May, a just transition for coal workers got started in Colorado when legislation passed to create a just transition for an equitable plan for coal-dependent communities and workers as the state transitions away from fossil fuels. Labor unions successfully pushed for wage differential benefits for those workers who end up in jobs that pay less than the jobs they currently have in the fossil fuel industry. To the refinery workers here tonight, I ask, what is your game plan for dealing with climate change? To community members and environmentalists here, I ask, what is your game plan for building an economy with good jobs for all? And not only for the workers losing their jobs who've been making a decent living, but for most people in the area who have long been shut out of good economic opportunity. Let us act in greater solidarity with one another. The divide and conquer strategy, which pits one working class community against another, benefits who? Oh yes, the 1%. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen. Okay, there are a number of workers who have already kept this room open longer than 45 minutes for us, and we only have less than 15 minutes left before they have earned the right to go home. So, yeah, by that time the list had been, sorry, do you want to sign up here now? I have 10 names. We have about 13 minutes. I'm sorry. I thought we were going to be able to get everybody in. The first name is Richard Goetz, the second name is David Steinberg, the third name is Martin Willis, and the fourth name is Peter Winslow. I will read others after that. If those four would please come up and try to limit your remarks to 1 minute so that everyone can at least say something for having put themselves on this list.
Last week when I was in this room, I spoke of some of the tremendous benefits that some students from Bach High School had from the previous operator of the refinery. In addition to my experience teaching in public schools, I also worked for 5 years as a senior environmental engineer for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, sister organization to PADEP. I have a bachelor's of science degree in civil engineering from NJIT, graduated with honors. During my time working with New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, evaluated applications for various industrial sites, represented the department public workshops, helped in revising state air pollution control regulations. But
Thank you.
Okay.
We stipulate your credentials. It's good.
All the environmental groups got 5 minutes to speak. If I'm the only refinery employee who should also get their fair time.
We can stay longer if somebody wants to ask the school.
All I'm asking for is the opportunity that the last 27 operators, the last 27 people had. okay? Last week and tonight, it sounds like people felt like I was entering a toxic environment as I drove from my Philadelphia neighborhood of Frankfurt into the refinery, that we were poisoning the neighborhood, and also myself as a worker, and that I worked at Ground Zero. From my education and work experience, both at New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and at the refinery, I know these accusations to be false. Any actions that myself and coworkers took would impact ourselves more than anybody else, and that's, I feel, is getting lost here. Any actions and anything that happened, we're assuming the biggest risk. We're assuming the biggest environmental risk. We're the biggest health risk, okay? And we truly do seek to have a safe environment. Dr. Farley from the city provided an objective presentation putting our emissions in perspective. Yeah, we are the largest emitter because we're the largest industry in the city. They spoke about aquifer issues that are being addressed, that have been addressed while the refinery has been operating, and aquifer issues can continue to be addressed if the refinery remains in use. Technology has changed over the years. I've heard some people say my grandmother was sick years ago. And I do feel for those individuals. I cannot speak to the time before the 16 years that I was in the refinery. But I know that even during my 16 years, technology has improved, and the refinery has improved with it. In my 16 years, we've replaced burners in 70% of our heaters, pump seals. Everything has changed. Any emissions that go to the air, that's money. The refinery really wants to sell that. They're not looking to pollute anything. They are looking to keep things in the pipe so that they can sell them. Safe, reliable, environmentally sound operation isn't just a blank motto on the wall. It's been ingrained in our minds since day one. I understand the public doubts, my concerns about public, if they'd seen thousands of dollars, thousands of hours I've donated to the Kensington community, maybe they would trust me a little bit more on that. But you've got to recognize people's self-interest. Myself, fellow educated engineers, chemists, work closely to the sources of pollution and assume more risk than others in the community. With all the technology that's currently there, I've chosen to stay. I'm an educated consumer of places to work. If the refinery opens its door or similar industrial use, I would willingly go back there tomorrow, as would many of my coworkers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goods. Mr. Steinberg. Thank you, Mr. Clancy.
Good evening. My name is David Steinberg, and I represent the Spring Garden Eco District. And I'm the kind of person, I'll put it this way. Many people look at things and wonder why. I like to look at things and say, why not? The Spring Garden Eco District today has issued a press release concerning reimagining the refinery site. I know my time is limited. I'm just going to hit some bullet points. But it's on the ecodistrictphiladelphia.org. And if anyone wants to get a copy of this, I'll be glad to provide them after these festivities are over. There are 5 planning categories representing our framework. It's a framework, it's not a plan, it's a framework for the redeveloping of the refinery site. First, aspirational values. Why can't we have residential, retail, commercial, industrial, recreational, and cultural activities on the site? Again, this is conceptual. Remediation. We've already talked about remediation a lot here. I'm not going to repeat. restorative, to bring the land back for eco-humanist use, regenerative, creating an environment that gives back more than it takes. There is a town in the country of Colombia called Gaviotas, which is the first post-petroleum organization, or first post-petroleum town, has successfully made the transition. We can do the same thing. Last point is designing human settlements, the eco-district model for a mixed-use design ethos. Now, if we have residential and commercial mixed use there, gee, I was looking at some maps and I saw this little scraggly line going from the Port of Philadelphia through the Navy Yard, up through the refinery, and through the east bank of the Schuylkill River, going underneath the Art Museum and up to the main railroad, which goes up to Washington, down to Washington, up to New York. Why can't a new SEPTA rail line be put in there that would also service the stadiums as well? Again, I'm not going to go into detail, but ecodistrictphiladelphia.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Steinberg. Martin Willis.
My name is Martin Willis. I came here tonight because the past two meetings about the refinery, all the opponents of the refinery have stated that skilled craftsmen like myself should transition from fossil fuel jobs to sustainable, environmental friendly jobs, and that the city of Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania should help us. I agree, the city of Philadelphia should be at the cutting edge and be in the forefront when it comes to transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables, and be honest with the costs. We have the city managing director here, we have the fire commissioner, and I believe the Office of Sustainability. Why not instead wait until the year 2050 to achieve an 80% reduction in fossil fuels? But start right now. Why not convert all the city's motor fleet from fossil fuel power to electric? We can start with the fire station on the corner of 24th and Passyunk Avenue. Not only will that convert all the police cars, but also the adjoining firehouse. We could place solar panels on the roof, and in place of the trees that have to be removed for the solar panels, install windmills along 24th Street. Everything has a cost. And just to give you a perspective how much it's going to cost to convert the entire motor fleet, the city of Philadelphia right now is sustaining bids to convert 100,000 street lights from fluorescent to LED. Not only will this take 2 to 3 years to achieve, but will cost anywhere between $50 million to $80 million. So just think, if the city of Philadelphia were to convert its entire motor fleet from fossil fuel gas to electric cars, how much that would cost? With the reduction of the city of Philadelphia, with the reduction of the PES refinery, the city of Philadelphia has lost $4 million by the end of this year in city wages. If you want to go to a renewable system, you would have to put windmills up and down the Schuylkill River. Everything has a cost. I've heard everyone coming here with what should...
Wait. No.
I've heard time and time again with sustainable jobs, but I have not heard any solutions. The same people who want the refinery closed know the same people that I do. Put your money where your mouth is.
Thank you, Mr. Willis. Mr. Winslow.
My name is Peter Winslow. I'm a member of the environmental justice community. Professor Hughes, thank you for sprinkling your academic pixie dust over the proceedings here, and I want to use some of that to speak collegially to some members of the advisory group. Mr. Abernathy, I understand the mandate of the advisory group is to assemble and give advice in the form of a report, and that you don't particularly want to color outside the lines. But I think you're going to have to go beyond the mandate that you have currently in addressing these problems, because the problems are too big. And in order to really do a service to the city, you really need, I think, to build trust. And I think that to do that, these issues do affect policy and decision making. And there are things that the city can do. So as acts of goodwill, I think you could use some imagination and reach out. For example, the Lower Schuylkill Master Plan could be opened up as a process for reconsideration. That's within the power of the city to do, and it's something that relates to this particular situation, the environment of the refinery. And I would say to your colleagues sitting to your sides, Commissioner Thiel and Dr. Farley, that a proactive addressing of the issues related to the use of hydrofluoric acid by anybody and the dangers that are involved and things that this city might do, I think that's an area where you can proactively work with the city council and have leadership from your offices of the administration. And I would say, just going down the line, Mr. Patterson, you and your colleague, Mr. Brown, who may have left by now, and also Mr. O'Neill, you recognize that the situation has changed when the refinery blew itself up on June 21st. As a result of that, the December 2020 deadline for completion of the work, the remediation process under Act 2 may not be possible and needs to be extended. By the same token, I think you should recognize that 120 days to have the community digest and understand everything that is involved in the remediation process and to actually be involved is not adequate. So I think that you should consider expanding that as well. Okay. And going back to Professor Hughes and Professor DiCarlo and Director Knapp, one of the things that we've accomplished tonight is to establish a little more comity than had existed in some of the previous discussions that took place, and I applaud you for that. In order to continue that, rather than wait for a final report to come out that is delivered from on high to the community, and to solicit more engagement and more back and forth with the community, I would hope that having collected not only from today's testimony but from other sources that I know that you're looking into, a vast amount of information, that it would be useful to have an interim report, at least on the environmental aspects of the work of the advisory group. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Winslow. And that brings us exactly to 8:30. I want to thank all the speakers, and I really, genuinely, personally, and I believe on behalf of the committee, thank all the courageous listening that happened in the audience this evening. It was a much more collegial event. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just to wrap that up, this isn't the last chance for public input. I know not everybody had a chance to speak tonight. There will be additional opportunities. And thanks for everything.
Thank you, Managing Director. And also, I want to say that anyone who has written comments or would like to write some can submit them on the city's website to the committee.